towards the end. Excellent. Good afternoon. The time is 5 p.m. on May, well, now it's after 5 p.m. It is 5:06 p.m. on May 4th, 2022, and this meeting of the District of Columbia State Board of Education is now called to order. The roll will now be called to determine the presence of a quorum. Mr. Hayworth, please call the roll.
Representative Lopez.
Present.
Representative Bernstein.
Present.
Representative Bright. Representative Bright. Representative Johnson. Representative Johnson. Representative Kasoy.
Present.
Representative Chang. Representative Chang. Representative Wattenberg.
Present.
Representative O'Leary.
Here.
Representative Parker. Representative Parker. Representative Sutter.
Present.
Representative Thompson.
Present.
Representative Reed. Representative Reed. Representative Patterson.
Present.
Madam President, you have quorum.
A quorum has been determined and the State Board will now proceed with the meeting. Welcome to those of us in the room for our second in-person working session of the State Board. I want to note for the public viewing this meeting via our live stream, we understand there were issues last month with the audio and video that made it difficult to follow the meeting. We've borrowed some technology from Aussie, thank you Aussie, to test out for this meeting. Please let us know after the meeting if this has worked better. It is important for the public to have clear and transparent access to our meetings, and we're committed to ensuring that that happens. I'm excited to announce that tonight, the application process for our student representatives and student advisory committee will open. Each year, the State Board selects 4 student representatives to serve on the State Board. These student representatives co-chair our student advisory committee and are welcome to sit on standing committees as well. The application will be open until June 1st, 2022. I encourage all of our State Board members to include information about the application in their communication with constituents. I am pleased now to turn to our Executive Director for his report.
Thank you, Madam President. Hello, everyone. I just have a couple quick reminders for everyone. The first of which is that the public filer financial disclosure is currently open and the deadline is approaching. So please make sure that you take care of that online. All members of the board that are elected are public filers, and certain individuals and staff who have budgetary responsibilities are designated as public filers or confidential filers, depending on the nature of their positions. The next thing I wanted to talk about is a little bit about the FY23 budget. As we've discussed via email, the council's budget, the committee of the whole has approved a draft budget, and the first vote on the budget, I believe, is in 2 weeks, June. Thank you. The 11th, next week. Thank you. It is on the 11th, and then a month later is the second vote in June on the budget. So we will keep you updated on those things. The committee of the whole did approve an additional position to the State Board, which is exciting to work on our education standards work. So that is very exciting. And I think that's all for me.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hayworth. Members have any questions about the report for Mr. Hayworth?
No, but I have a question for you.
Sure.
Where is the information about the student representative
I'm
applications?
guessing it's on our website. Is that accurate, Mr. Hayworth?
It will be, and it will also be in our social media, and we will send out a blurb. Thank you. That's a great segue, actually. We will also be sending out to members a blurb to put in all newsletters and items like that over the coming months, and it will be open until the end of May. So that's exciting.
Okay, thank you.
For members of the public who might not have heard the beginning of that question, the question is about how and where folks can find information on the student representative application. So we will be getting that on the website and sending that out. Any other questions? All right. I will now welcome Donna Johnson, Director of Accountability at Aussie, to provide an update for the board on the accountability amendment process. Ms. Johnson, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to see all of you and see many of you in person, and to those board members that are remote, hello again. My name is Donna Johnson. I'm Director of Accountability with Aussie, and I'm excited to bring an update to you on the work that we have been doing regarding the development of our amendment to our ESSA state plan. So today we're going to go over a review of that timeline, what those revisions include, a deeper outline of what accountability and report card schedule looks like overall to get a big picture of all of the items that are underway over the next several months, and then review for you some specific areas of revision. As you may recall, back in March, the last time I spoke with you, we outlined some priority areas, and we'll be updating you on where we are with respect to the feedback that's received and the decisions that we are progressing forward on, with the intent of bringing forward a draft amendment in the beginning of June. I'm not sure if the,
I have it.
awesome. So I'm moving on to slide 4. Okay.
Members, this is all in our packets.
Our ESSA state plan for timeline updates, just so everyone is aware, we are in the first phase of this work, which is March through May, and that's where we have been engaging our LEA task force members, external members from focus groups, gathering conversations around some of the changes. Then between June and July is where we will publish our draft ESSA state plan amendment for public comment. We will then plan to present to the state board in June and again in July, with the anticipation of a vote by the state board in July. Upon approval, it would then be submitted to the U.S. Department of Education for final approval. And then we begin work on finalizing the accountability framework technical guide, which is all of the details that are outside of the ESSA plan pertinent to the accountability framework. So that is important for our LEAs so that they have that in their hands as close to the start of the school year as possible. And then, as we've discussed before, once we have those things finalized, then we get to engage on the things outside of the accountability system that are a part of the DC school report card, including components, design, functionality, a lot of those things that a lot of people are really excited to dig into. So far, between the last time I spoke with you in March and what we have upcoming through the end of May, we will have had 7 meetings with our LEA task force, 5 meetings with 5 focus group meetings with parent groups, 4 different meetings with educational advocacy groups, 4 meetings with ward education councils, 2 different meetings with school level stakeholders, which includes the principal advisory council and the teacher advisory council, which are upcoming. And then we've had 2 meetings with the student advisory council. And then we have what we call some combined group of advocates, which are more of our title group. So it's our Title I practitioners group, our state advisory panel on special education, which is coming up tomorrow. And then we have our Title III, which is our English learner advisory group, and those are coming up next week. The Title I is towards the end of the month. The next slide outlines an overview, and this is really to give you perspective of all of the things that are in play during this time period. So while we're talking about the accountability changes for the ESSA amendment that will take place in the report card that gets published in 2023, it's important to have context for all the other things that are still going on at this same time period that aren't impacted by this work that we're spending a lot of time talking about. So as you know, in December, we released the 2021 report card. We have a new update coming for that report card. As you are probably all aware, every spring, we provide an update on the per pupil expenditure, the school finance data. That is coming released June 1st. So you'll see that on the report card. And then we have the 2022 report card, which we are eagerly anticipating final approval from US Ed for our accountability addendum. Then we will publish under that addendum the requirements for our report card based on the 21-22 school year. And then in the fall of 23 is when we get to publish the report card that includes the accountability framework changes that we're talking about today. So as we look forward to some of the revisions that we talked about, back in March, I shared with the board, and we have used and shared this with every external and LEA group that we have had thus far, making sure that everyone is aware of and grounding decisions upon the key principles for our accountability framework. In those principles, we have foundational principles as well as design and use principles. Some of the foundational principles are pertinent to and required by law, such as providing common information about all of our public schools, DCPS as well as public charter schools. Making sure that the overall accountability score that we calculate provides a meaningful distribution of results. We have taken that a step further to say that not only do we believe and are committed to making sure that it has a meaningful distribution of results, but that we do not want it to be a forced curve, but a distribution that shows meaningful differentiation across a variety of levels of performance for our schools. We also know under federal rules, we are required to put a substantial amount of weight on our core academic measures. We ground this in the fundamental belief that all students can learn and achieve at high levels, but we recognize the current reality that there are significant gaps in performance and achievement among our student groups, specifically those that have been historically underserved, such as those along the lines of race, income, language, and disability. We want to make sure that the overall accountability system incentivizes improvement, but has a deliberate focus on equity, particularly those students who have been historically underserved. We want to make sure that any calculation, any aggregation, any disaggregation of our accountability framework is fair and an accurate representation of school performance, which provides for the future having historical comparison as well as comparability of those overall calculations over time, and that those calculations can be used for high stakes decision making and to support programmatic and systemic improvement. We know that our stakeholders use this data in a variety of ways. We want to make sure that the data and the way in which it's presented, calculated, as well as aggregated is used to inform and drive educational improvement as well as systemic improvement. We believe that this needs to be a tool that our educational leaders can use in order to support the development of measures, as well as measure the impact of different programmatic investments and shifts over time. And lastly, but certainly not least, we know that this is a tool that helps inform parents in a variety of decisions that they have to make, whether it's informing them and giving them information that can better help them engage with their school leaders in meetings that they attend, or to engage them in decisions that they make around the educational decisions for their child. And those are the decisions that we ground ourselves in with every one of these decisions coming up. And we ask ourselves, how do they align with that? So back in March, we had an overview for you where we talked about some of the key priorities. And I want to recap where we are with those. And so I'm going to talk about each one of those, and we're on, for those following along, we're on slide 9. The first item for revision that we outlined were adjusting the student group weights in the STAR framework. So currently, we have an all student group weight that is weighted at 75%. We are looking at this to reduce the all student group weight to somewhere between 30 and 40%. We're still finalizing feedback and gathering what our recommendation will be. Based on feedback so far, that's the range that we're looking at. We are also looking at increasing the weight of our economically disadvantaged group. As you recall, currently what we have defined that as is our at-risk population. And we are looking to increase that from the current 5% up to 30 to 35%. Currently, our race ethnicity student groups are combined to be a total of 5%. We're looking to increase that to between 10 and 20%. We're looking to maintain our students with disability weight at 10 and our English learner weight to be somewhere either maintained at 5 or slightly increased. One of the other things that we are looking at is to think about how we strengthen the measurement and better reward growth, one of our other key focus areas in addition to improving equity. We have talked about changing our attendance metrics. As you are aware, we talked about last time, our current system has what's called a best of metric, which is something that we need to remove from our plan so that we can make sure that we are measuring the same metrics for all schools. So by removing that best of metric, which is using 90% attendance and attendance growth, we want to go ahead and formally change out 90% attendance for chronic absenteeism. Over the last 2 years, we have reported chronic absenteeism on our report card. Chronic absenteeism is something that we already have to calculate and report federally. And so this would be a consistent move with what we have been doing over the last several years. We also know that there's been a lot of confusion around what 90% attendance is, where a lot of people understand what chronic absenteeism is. Attendance growth is a measure that this board has talked quite a bit about in terms of being a measure that is less associated with socioeconomic levels. In the prior system, it was not measured for all schools. What we're looking to do is to actually now include that as a measurement for all schools, substituting it where in-seat attendance used to be. The rationale for that is that in-seat attendance does not show the level of differentiation in a meaningful manner between schools, and attendance growth would better reward growth and show better differentiation between our schools. We also are looking to make those changes on our pre-K measures. In our system for schools that serve pre-K, we have a pre-K ISA measure. We would substitute that out for a pre-K chronic absenteeism measure to make sure that we're being consistent with measuring common things in common ways. In the next area of how we would better reward growth, we have been doing a lot of work actually prior to the pandemic. And so we've been waiting to be able to implement these changes of looking at how we can better measure the progress that our English learners are making with learning proficiency and gaining proficiency in English. We know that our access assessment, which is the assessment for our English learners, was revised right before we adopted and put our ESSA plan into place. And we had a commitment to go back and review what that new assessment looked like and then look at our trajectory and our goals. And so we are planning to set forth nonlinear goals, recognizing that that aligns better with research around how English learners are actually attaining proficiency in the language. We would also be able to award points for a proportion of the growth goals that are met from one year to the next. We feel that this will be a better representation of how our students, our English learners, are making progress in attaining proficiency in English. Next, around improving equity, we're looking at the definition of economically disadvantaged. So you heard me talk about that just a little bit, in that in our first ESSA plan, we defined economically disadvantaged as being the at-risk student group. We recognize that there's some significant overlap as well as some misunderstanding of that terminology and the fact that the at-risk group is used in a variety of ways in a variety of situations in education, from funding to accountability to a lot of different ways that it may be perceived, and sometimes a negative connotation as well. Moreover, we see that ESSA requires that we identify a student group that is representative of economically disadvantaged. And our at-risk population isn't always reflective of economically disadvantaged. In our conversations with our stakeholders, we recognize that there is a significant interest in making sure that we are holding schools accountable and measuring the performance that our high schools are making with students who are overage and undercredited. And so one of the revisions that we are considering is reviewing what that definition looks like to remove overage and undercredited from that definition so that it was a consistent subgroup used in elementary, middle, and high school, but still stay committed to reporting the performance of our overage and undercredited students so that we're able to monitor how high schools are supporting them without calculating them in the accountability framework. Next slide. One area that I've gotten to speak with this board about quite a bit is the development of a high school growth measure. As you know, in 2019, I presented to you our plan for developing a high school growth measure, and that was suspended. And so we are now excited that with the implementation of assessments again this year, we are back on track to begin the development of that growth measure with the projected implementation for following the 23-24 school year. As a reminder, we need multiple years of data in order to be able to calculate that growth metric. And we also want to make sure that we are being responsible in the development of that growth measure, that not only do we have multiple years of data, but we have the ability to review and model that metric before implementing it in a high stakes manner. So that's why you see the timeline of 23-24, which is consistent with the timeline that we brought forward in 2019 with the original plan, given the gap in assessment years. The other commitment that we made was removing the star rating from the accountability calculations. If you take a look at our original ESSA state plan, you'll see that there's significant verbiage in that plan around the calculation of the accountability system, which talks about the calculation, the student group weights, and then it goes into detail about how it takes that calculation of a 0 to 100 score and equates it to a star rating. We are committed to removing that language and talking about how we will use the calculation of our score with the purpose, as we know, required for those school designations. The opportunity to think about what that means and what those scores represent is something that's outside the scope of our ESSA plan, something that we have the ability to continue to dialogue with our stakeholders and get additional feedback for how we display that. The one thing that we have been committed to and stay strong on, and you'll see in the draft of our ESSA plan, is that any reference to aggregating that from a calculation to a rating will be removed. Next slide. Over the last several years, we have been publishing our 4- and 5-year graduation rates. One of the components of the ESSA state plan require us to identify schools with low graduation rates, and we do that using the 4- and 5-year graduation rate. However, we didn't have both 4- and 5-year graduation rates in our accountability framework. We had the 4-year, and we had a rather wonky metric called extended year graduation, which still used the universe of the 4-year graduation rate, but had a numerator that was slightly different. And so to find alignment between our designations as well as what we are publishing federally and reporting in our federal reports, we are moving that 5-year graduation rate into the accountability framework. We are also looking to remove the SAT DC percentile metric. That is a metric that has been in our framework. We have 2 SAT metrics. One is a college career readiness benchmark. The other is a DC percentile metric. Removing that metric, one, we did not see a lot of meaningful differentiation between our schools. And 2, it allows us to have points that we can then allocate towards our high school growth metric. We have some additional items that are under consideration. We just had on LEA task force to talk about some things today. And we have additional information that we need to gather and think about what timelines look like, what's feasible, what isn't feasible, is around revisions to our college readiness metrics on our framework. Currently, those are referred to as AP or IB metrics. And there's been conversation for multiple years now around finding ways that we can integrate dual enrollment into that metric. And then the additional information that we talked about around new metrics that could be added, whether or not they were added now or in the future. It looks like there would definitely be something that we'll have to consider in the future, given the availability of data and the timeline of integrating that. And those would involve career readiness and DC science. Throughout the work of our engagement, we have had a number of things that we also have to change in our ESSA plan beyond just those accountability frameworks. So as you know, we've had waivers, addendums, a variety of flexibilities provided by USAID over the last couple of years due to the pandemic. So we need to integrate those changes that they've granted through those short-term flexibilities and represent them into our formal ESSA plan. That's always one of the things that we agree to when we are granted those flexibilities. So shifting those long-term goals in alignment with what is in our most recent addendum is one of those requirements, as well as making sure that we outline any necessary changes that are reflected to our school improvement designations based on those waivers and addendums for timelines, methodology, exit criteria. So any of that language that was in there will be integrated in the way in which we have signed our assurances to do so. Throughout the external engagement, we have also received feedback, and we've had some conversations about non-ESSA amendment related items. And so while they won't be a part of our ESSA state plan, it's almost impossible to engage in some of these conversations without entering into some of these areas of discussion. And so I wanted to give you some quick synopsis of what some of the feedback that we've received are. So we've gotten significant interest from external stakeholders around finding ways that we can provide additional context around the meaning of a metric score, making sure that whether that means the way we display it and we provide performance ranges, we show trend data where it's possible, we provide some context around how this school is performing compared to statistically similar demographics. We provide information around performance ranges, whether we provide text around what that means, how they're succeeding, where they might still be struggling or underperforming. A lot of those things are feedback that our external stakeholders have communicated. They'd like to see that because that would make the information more meaningful to them and more actionable. We also know that we've gotten wide interest in how we can better represent school climate, whether that is through parent or student satisfaction, a student or staff well-being, the overall vibe of the school. So there we go. So we also have had a significant conversation around information regarding school staffing. And as you are aware, Aussie is about to release some more information about school staffing. We've also had feedback from stakeholders related to mental health counselors, the number of nurses that are available at a school, whether or not there's a school health center at the school, and then some questions about the level of EL staff at the school and the type of security or the amount of security at the school. And then specifically related to demographics of teachers and retention, which is actually something that you will see added to the 2022 report card. So in advance of any 2023 changes, we're planning to make that change. So our next steps to reframe where we are. Here we are in May. It's hard to believe that it's May. We are wrapping up our engagement on this phase of the revisions to the accountability system. We will be drafting our SS state plan, presenting it to you in June for another discussion in July and then action in July. And then we'll begin the work that happens after that, where we will be working on the technical guide for our LEAs and then begin engagement on report card components, design, functionality, look, feel, all of those things that will take place later in the fall and winter as we move forward in that work, all with a guideline of looking at December 23 as the release of the new accountability scores, with components of the report card being released during that fall of 2023. And then just as an upcoming Aussie and SBOE engagement, in addition to the meetings that I know you have between our leaderships, we also have today's working session. In June, as we finalize that amendment, we'll be sharing it to you, posting it for public comment. We'll have the June working session where I'll be presenting what that accountability draft amendment looks like so that you can take a look at that to consider for action in July. We'll answer additional questions that you have in July, as well as show any changes that have taken place between the June publication, public comment received, how any changes were made as a result of that public comment on the July draft that will be sent to you for vote in July, hopefully. Approval then leads to US Ed. And that is all that I have for you today. Happy to take any questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Ms. Johnson. Super helpful updates. Are there questions for Ms. Johnson? Representative Wattenberg?
Yeah, so first of all, welcome in person.
Thank
you. And thank you for acknowledging the interest that there is in the climate and in the teacher retention and the commitment on the high school growth. My first question, I have multiple ones that start with this, is I'm trying to understand what is going on. I understand that you're going to get rid of the verbiage regarding a star rating and that there's not going to be a star rating, which is fine. Our interest in our resolution was about a summative rating, not a star rating. It's about a summative rating. And the reason was because when you do the calculation based on meaningful difference, given all the federal requirements, you end up with a number that, insofar as it does what it's supposed to do, it's about school need, not about school quality. And people take it to be about school quality. And I think they will do that if it's a number or whatever it is. So my question is, how do you intend, and I realize you don't have to make this decision until later, but I'll just say, for me, I wouldn't be comfortable voting for this if I didn't understand your thinking on it. So for me, I'd like to know, how do you intend to present it? Because for me, if you're going to have a number, that's fine. In a lot of cases, we don't publicize numbers that aren't relevant. But if we do, we should be, because of transparency, which is your argument, we have to be very clear what it is meant to say. And I think it's very important that it should say, this number reflects the calculation based on a criteria provided by the federal government, plus some of ours, to indicate school need for extra support. And I want to know, is that what it's going to say, or is it going to say something else? Because to me, that's what is relevant. I don't want to be party to any kind of report that is going to misinform people about school quality.
I'll be very candid. We don't know what it's going to say. I think saying right now what it is going to say and what it would not say would shortchange some of the feedback that we've yet to do. One of the things that I will.
You could say it by the time we got to July.
Well, that would be that's outside the scope of the ESSA amendment. And so if we're going to think about, and I will push back in terms of types of feedback that we've received so far, different stakeholders have said, we'd like to see that the different indicator components. So we talked here about attendance, growth, proficiency, graduation rate. They would like to see those arranged in a certain way across the screen and then have that overall score somewhere down at the bottom. We've had stakeholders say, I'd like to see a paragraph saying this score reflects high performance and achievement, but underperformance in academic growth. So we've gotten a lot of different feedback.
No, I understand that. So I'm saying you have that feedback, so you can come with.
I don't feel like we've been able to do a significant amount of feedback on that because it's outside of the scope of our ESSA plan. That is more about a design functionality. Additionally, that is outside the scope of the approval that is required for an ESSA plan. And so putting that into our ESSA plan really locks us into what that would look like and gives that authority over to the U.S. Department of Education, which is not something that they have. And so we have that, they could look at that and say, no, we don't want to approve that part, but that's outside the scope of the statute. And so we have the opportunity to really do additional feedback with our stakeholders, mock up some things of what that could look like once we have our ESSA plan developed, and think about how can we provide meaningful information. I don't think that putting something in there that said this is federally required and based on all of the things that they see above it is going to meet what we're hearing from our parents and families about telling them something meaningful about that piece of data.
Representative Wattenberg, there's another question from Representative Patterson. So I would
my
like,
timer, I can stop.
we don't have a timer, so we're just going in rounds of questions. So, okay.
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah, sorry, Representative Patterson is online,
Oh, got it.
and we have him. So I'm going to come next, Representative Patterson.
And I hope to follow in the same line as my former co-chair, because I wanted to just make sure that we were clear on the summative score. So it's still in the same nature of that. So I want us to be clear, especially for people listening as well. So there's going to be a summative score because that is part of your guiding principles, correct?
There is an overall score. In order to be able to identify the bottom 5%, we have to calculate an overall score. And what Aussie has committed to is being transparent about that and making sure that that score is available. What we have heard and has been communicated, not just from you, but from a number of external stakeholders as well, is that they would like to see that score not located at the top of the page. They would like to see additional context provided around what makes up that score. Be very clear, how did that score come to be? What does it say about the performance of the school? Does it say that they have high growth? Do they have low growth? Do they have high achievement? That's the type of information that we're hearing.
And I appreciate that, Ms. Johnson. And I'm okay with that, me personally, as a representative, with you making that statement. I just didn't want to make it clear because that was one of the recommendations that it was done away with. And from what I'm hearing, there will be a summative score. That is not one of the recommendations that will be responded to in the sense of that it goes away. So there's going to be a summative score of some kind. And if I'm understanding you from your presentation, how that's presented is up for discussion in what we're hearing, so to speak. Is that correct as well?
So yeah, so the commitment around removing the single summative rating is what we fulfilled by removing the star rating. An overall score is not a single summative rating. That's the calculation that's done. Yeah.
Okay. And I just wanted to be clear about that because I want to set clear expectations. So when I talk to people in the community and tell them the differentiation between that and that, yes, the stars are going away, but there will be a summative score, and talk to them about that and just give them the more detail, the nuances about it. So I appreciate your answer, Ms. Johnson. Thank you very much.
I just want to make sure I know who else has questions. Dr. O'Leary, did you have a question?
I have a number of questions.
Okay, can we go with one? And then I'm going to come to Representative Parker and then Vice President Thompson and then Representative Reed. Okay, and then Representative Bernstadt. So I'll go in this order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Let me ask a couple of questions that can do yes or no.
I'll do my best.
The groups and the external engagement that you talked about, how are the groups chosen? You mentioned blanket groups like committees and things like that, but how does is there a way for a community person to become a part of a group, to be part of the groups that you're talking about?
So we put the information out on our website. We also sent emails out to a variety of contacts. Some of those contacts were ones that were presented and provided directly from the state board. We broke it up into parent groups, into education advocacy groups, and into the ward education councils. All of those were provided direct email about the sessions that were offered. They were open to everyone. They did not have to register. They could simply attend. We put the information up on our website as well.
Okay, just as something that I've been talking about since we had websites, is that the website may not be the way to get to a lot of people. Is there another way? I've always talked about putting a sign on a bus or something like that, but is there another way that maybe the chancellor or
I believe DCPS did actually share information with their parent groups. We provided all of that to DCPS as well as to the Public Charter School Board to share with their parent groups as well.
Okay. Thank you. I have.
Can I go to Representative Parker and then we'll come
Yeah.
back around? All right, Representative Parker.
A few questions.
We're going to go one and then on around. Everyone's going to do one.
Oh, we're
Because
only
we-
doing one question.
Everyone's got questions, so we'll
Okay.
come back around in rounds, but let's let everyone get a
Okay,
question.
well, I'll jump to this one, just trying to differentiate. So, the making public, or when you talk about contextualizing the score, where I know there was some discussion around cohort modeling, like, is that even possible? And so, when you think about comparing one school or these groups of students in one school to these groups of students in another, or another way of thinking about it is, how are these groups of students performing over a period of time, 2-3 years compared to another group? I guess, is that even in the realm of possibility in terms of the contextualization, or is that not even what you're hearing?
So one of the things that we have talked about in terms of contextualization is not comparing a school and saying you are like school A, school B, school C. That is, I think, a very inflammatory approach to take.
Agreed.
What we have talked about, and we've had conversations with our LEAs as well as external groups, is creating a statistical similar school measure. So you're able to create, based on state level data, a statistical model of what a school with the same demographic makeup in a very bespoke manner could look like. And so you're able to say, hey, are you performing at or above the value of a school made up of your same demographic makeup based on what the state's doing
And is it
overall?
possible to do that on the student
That-
level, or is that not even possible?
Well, this isn't on a student, so I'm not sure what you mean by at a student level, because you would do it at a metric level. So you would
To
say this school,
X, to say, let's say, at-risk students in school X are performing like at-risk students across the city, for instance.
we already do that. We actually already show how at-risk students at school X are performing compared to at-risk students. What this would do is it would say your school is made up of X percentage of at-risk females, Y percentage of non-at-risk males, and it would aggregate that and say, this is your school's similar metric score. And so it would give you a statistically similar, almost a synthetic model of a school based on state level data.
Got it.
And
And
so-
last follow-up to my question to that, does that influence the overall rating?
No, that would
calculation?
simply be a contextualized approach. It is not an accountability component. That is not something that would be in our ESSA plan. That would be a display for contextualization.
So I'm going to come to Representative Thompson, Dr. Reed, Representative Gasoy, and I've got a question. And we're going to try to end this at 6 o'clock. Representative Bernstad. Representative Thompson.
Okay, I'm gonna model one true question.
Thank you.
My one question is, so I appreciate a cleaner data set with regards to removing the overage and undercredited from economically disadvantaged. I am curious, with the removal, can you just talk more about how you plan to reflect the overage and undercredited and any progress and growth that they have?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. On our report card, in addition to the accountability student groups that we have, we also report a variety of student groups. We report performance by gender, children in foster care, military connected children, migrant students if we have them. This would add one of those other reported components. And so that would be on the report card. You'd be able to see the measure. And of course, we show trend data for all of those.
Thank you.
Welcome. Representative Reed.
I think it's a question. Okay, can you just tell me how many people were engaged? And then I do have a question about the adults, like how's the 100 score going to be different from the bottom 8 websites you currently have, the comprehensive support, like that specific website that shows that the bottom 8 or the bottom 5% of schools, which is 8 schools. How is that different? Because you were saying that you have to be transparent, and we already have some level of transparency. So I'm just trying to figure out, one, kind of gauge how many people are external stakeholders, and then two, that whole piece about the 100.
Yeah, so so we have our LEAs, and so every LEA is invited. Not every LEA has participated. We have had, roughly about 30 LEAs have participated in each one of our sessions.
How many people, like, I mean, I know it's 30 LEAs, but like, was it like one person showing up at LEA A?
So there are their data experts that come to those, because these are data heavy centric groups. So sometimes it's more than one person from an LEA. Sometimes you might have DCPS and 5 people. But in terms of thinking about the number of LEAs that are represented in the room, generally it's about 30 different LEAs that are represented at our LEA task force meeting.
Right,
But
the stakeholder, because you're saying like external stakeholders. So
yeah, so our
the word
external
education
focus
sounds
groups,
like 2 people showed up.
those focus groups that we've had have not been as well attended as I would like.
Okay.
I will say that the focus groups that we had, that we posted and let as an all come, we had some where no one showed up except for members of board. So thank you. There are others that we had where we had groups such as the PAVE parent organization reached out and said, hey, can you attend one of our existing meetings? And we had really strong attendance at that meeting. I think they had about 20, 25 people, and it was a virtual meeting. They've all been virtual. But so it's varied. Sometimes no one showed up, sometimes 2 people. I've had a couple of meetings where I did a one-on-one session with a stakeholder and was able to take all the questions they wanted. But we had them available. We made them available there. We've offered to do additional push-ins. We've got some additional meetings coming up. I really believe that at this level of the engagement in terms of the accountability changes, the feedback that we're hearing from people is that they want to talk about the display. They want to talk about what does it look like when it's on the report card. And I think just like what we saw in 2018, we have a lot more engagement when we start talking about the report card than we do about the development and the methodology of the accountability framework. There's probably a lot that could be said about that, but that's what we saw in the past, and it's really following true with what we're seeing now. So engagement hasn't been high. I know I've heard some feedback from some of our ward education council members who said they were confused as to why they were being invited to these meetings because they thought they'd already given all their feedback to the state board. And so, that feedback came as well. And and as I, tried to explain is that we're talking about some very different things than what the state board was talking about. We're talking about the calculations and the methodology of the accountability framework that may not have been specific to a lot of the conversations that were really meaningful and helpful that the state board had with stakeholders that talked more about the report card, the design, and the display. And so, you know, it's been a variety of things. It hasn't been an overwhelming number of people, but it hasn't been empty. So.
Okay, I'm in trouble. But the second part of my question, because I have a parent who's like, how did she engage in 2018 with Aussie, not with us? And she was like, well, and how was my comments from 2018 considered? So anyway, could you answer the second part, which wasn't the second part question, a whole different question about that 100, the difference between how the 100, you said it was transparency, but then there's already transparency with the bottom 5% on its own website. Could you kind of talk about this picture?
So we actually have to publish the bottom 5% on our DC school report card, and it is there. We also have a link to where we publish the information around the school improvement plans and the funding. That's very different than the accountability calculation. That's once the bottom 5% are identified. And there's a lot more than just comprehensive support, lowest 5% that's required under ESSA. We also have targeted school supports. We have additional targeted school supports. Eventually we'll have comprehensive support 3. We'll have, you know, different times. That is talking about the monitoring and the supports for the school, not the calculation. And so what we're talking about is the calculation that generated and formed what's called a threshold for bottom 5%. Nowhere on that school improvement page is that threshold and the outline of school performance located or any information about the calculation of their score. That's just talking about the plans and the support. That's not a part of the DC school report card. That's separate.
Representative Bernstadt.
Okay, this is a 1.5 part question. I'll be brief. Good evening. It's great to meet you in person. So I'm looking at this and the SAC stuff. So currently, the STAR framework group, race, ethnicity gets 5 points, and it's divided up equally.
That is correct.
By all present race ethnicity groups. So if for example, there was 5, each group would get 1 point. My clip. So I'm understanding that right?
Correct.
Okay, that's the one. The 0.5 question is, now that so it says increase race ethnicity to 10 to 20%, which I'm assuming is 10 to 20 points. That would still be split up equally?
Yes, we actually had that question that we raised with our technical committee of LEAs, our data specialists there. We raised that question around, you know, asking them their thoughts on should it still be equally broken out around the race ethnicity groups that were present, or should it be proportionate based on?
That's what I was going to ask.
and they supported keeping it equal.
Okay. Can I ask? Actually, no.
Okay.
Move on.
Dr. Gasoy.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Donna, for the presentation and for being there. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I am wondering if there is going to be engagement of principals, because they seem like they'd be the stakeholders who'd actually be able to engage in the more technical aspect of this. To your point, you know, this is hard for a lot of lay folks to actually wrap our minds around. But I haven't heard about principals being part of sort of the concerted outreach or a group that's been reached out to. So just curious about that.
Yes, on slide 5, and I believe we talked about it a little bit last time as well, but we actually have our meeting coming up. We haven't had it yet with the Principals Advisory Council. And so we have that meeting coming up. It's next week. We also have a meeting with the Teachers Advisory Council. And there are principals who serve on the Title I Committee of Practitioners. And we will have had 2 meetings with them by the end of this engagement cycle.
Great, thank you. And I couldn't hear if my colleague Representative Reed asked about engagement. I heard that. Do you have a total number at this point? Do you know how many folks have?
When we've finished everything, we'll be able to total that. That is a part of our ESSA plan submission, where we have to outline the public engagement that was had. We're not finished with all of it yet. We actually have the slide deck on our website, as well as the survey that follows up. So anyone who was unable to make the meeting is able to actually review those materials and provide feedback. So we don't have a total number that is completed yet, because we haven't finished all of our stakeholder engagement.
Great, thank you.
Thank you all. So it's 5:56. I'm going to ask a question, then we may have a couple more minutes for another round of questions from folks. Would you be willing to stick with us till 6:05? Okay, good.
I'll stick with you till 6:15.
Excellent. All right, we got time then. So let me ask my question here. The dangerous things you're offering here. So I appreciate the changes to the metrics here, and I want to just voice for the public that one of the things we talked about in the Assessment Accountability Committee last year, as we were working towards our recommendations in the resolution, was that we felt like this modeling, this piece of the mathematics around the metrics was best left to Aussie, because this is your bailiwick. But I want to understand, now that you're getting into the weeds on this and changing the numbers, things like moving the at-risk percentage and reducing the all-student weight. Are you modeling this at all? Are you taking a look at how this would change things if we were using prior year data?
So we had actually looked at this a couple of years ago in terms of when we did our STAR analysis. So we published that STAR brief every year. And then as we were ramping up for making changes back in 2019, we started modeling this data and started thinking about what these changes would look like. There's a lot of risk of using 2019 data to say definitively, this is what this will do. We can look at it and we can see the trends. We can look at the changes in association with socioeconomic levels. We also know that one of the very complicating factors of our system is the fact that we have bespoke floors and targets, which is the minimum value of which you can earn a point in the metric, and the maximum value of which you'd earn all of the points. Those are unique to each metric, each student group, each grade level. Really wonderful. I'll prompt that STAR video, which outlines it and explains it. But because those are based upon a combination of historical data and criterion-based data, those will change. And the goal of those is to use those to both address where we're starting and where we need to move to close those gaps. So to run these purely on floors and targets set based on 16-17 data would not give us the full picture. What it allows us to do in terms of making a statistically informed decision is to look at the data and say, hey, historically, if everything were the same as it was back in 2019, we didn't have a high school growth metric then, so that's also a little challenging. But do you see a lot of movement on the tails? And is there anything that jumps off that says, oh, that doesn't make a lot of sense? And we're not seeing that. We are seeing some positive shifts around the equity concerns we had around socioeconomic levels with the association with at-risk groups. That's one of the things that we had called out in our STAR brief. I believe it's also something you called out in your resolution.
My follow-up question on that is exactly that. So given that, one of the concerns the board has raised is the STAR rating for us did not accurately capture how our schools were serving the students in their building. Given some of these changes, can you speak generally about, do these changes help address that concern?
We believe that these changes would help address that concern. I think one thing that will better alleviate some of that and give greater context is some of the things we've been talking about around how to understand what a metric means in terms of how you're serving students in comparison to similar populations. But that's not an accountability factor, that's an explainability factor.
I appreciate that. Okay, more questions. Okay, Representative Bernstad, Dr. O'Leary, Representative Reed, then Representative Wattenberg. Okay.
So back to what I asked earlier about how the groups are split up. So I know part of the engagement questions, at least for the SAC, were about how the student group weights should be shifted. So I think I possibly understand why, because if they were all proportionate, then it would be similar to just all student weights. But can you speak about what you kind of mentioned earlier about why it's not proportional and why it's split up equally?
On the race ethnicity?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So on race ethnicity, one of the considerations is that if it is split up equally, then you are holding them accountable for at the same rate for every race ethnicity that is present and generating a student group score within that metric. So you're holding accountable for every race ethnicity and you're equally weighting the fact that they need to support each one of those race ethnicities at the same level. So each one of those race ethnicities has a unique floor and target, but then you're aggregating that together to get an individual student group score for a Black African American, for Hispanic, for white, for 2 or more races. Each one of those get a unique score, but when you're calculating them, they come together to serve as 20%.
Okay, that makes so much more sense. I think that was more my question. Thank you.
Okay. Representative O'Leary.
I want to applaud your presentation. I really enjoyed listening to what you had to say about things. And there have been a lot of changes, positive changes as far as I'm concerned. One thing that hasn't changed, and I think that it needs to be looked at, two things really, is the concept of being economically disadvantaged. I don't think that that is, I think that that's even more of a curse than at risk. So I guess that as an English teacher, I'm looking for a euphemism that would be able to identify what you're talking about. But I would not feel good if I was labeled as being economically disadvantaged. Probably I know I am, but I don't need to be labeled that. Okay, so that's just something that I thought about. Unless I misheard about this changing the accountability framework revisions, it seems to me like there's been a sea change in the percentages. Is that what I heard? And I'm
Of
talking,
the student group weights?
yeah,
Yes, there's a significant, we're recommending significant changes in the
Right.
student group weights.
and you were talking about chronic absenteeism.
Correct.
Which was probably more of a euphemism than whatever the thing was called up before. But you didn't mention anything about the 80-20 and the 60-40. I might have missed it, but I didn't hear that today.
So that change is about the attendance policy. And so when
That's what's
attendance
gonna be
policy,
coming up.
that's different. Yep.
Thank you.
After these messages from our sponsor.
I won't have to ask that question.
Dr. Reed.
So, yes, part B of my notes was, I really do like slide 15. Particularly just about school staff and teacher retention, mental health. Those are things that I was hearing from like engagement. So love that. And did I hear that? We're going back to the 100. I said more about that 100 overall score. We don't have the components yet of the what will be the 100, the score, the overall score. That
So we do know that there are 5 indicators: academic achievement, other academic indicator, which can be academic growth at the elementary, middle school.
Okay, that's
The ESSA plan. Yep, that's what that is.
okay.
Mhm.
So those would be the things. that-
Those are the accountability indicators. Yes.
That's it.
All right, thank you, Dr. Reed. Representative Wattenberg.
Yeah, so I have some complicated questions around weights, but can I call you separately because I need to talk them out to understand them? And I don't think this is the best place to do it. So can I just reach out to you?
Yeah. Is there anything is there anything I can address now that might, or
Well,
I'm just thinking about everyone else that's listening. So I'm trying to, if
well,
you
I
have the
another-
question,
I have
somebody
another-
else
I
might.
have another question that's shorter, and I think to go through the
Okay.
weights, it's gonna be more of a back and forth, and then maybe what will come of it is a clearer question that I can use with everybody next time. It's just so much is unclear to me about how that's gonna end up playing out.
Okay.
And I don't. So a simpler question is, so you say that you're gonna get rid of one of those SAT scores,
The DC
the
percentile.
DC
Correct.
percentile, and replace it with growth, but in year one.
No.
Oh, did I? with
We're
the
not,
high school growth?
not with
Oh.
SAT growth. We're using those 5 points to go towards the high school growth
So
measure.
that's what I'm.
Okay,
yeah,
sorry.
that's what I mean. But in year one, there won't be a high school growth measure, so.
So the denominator will not be 100.
I see.
Yep.
Okay,
That's all.
all right. And then if I have,
Yeah, and if you have questions about these weights, I think it might help all of us to know what you're asking about.
well, here, I mean, let me see if I can, so this gets to the purpose of it, right? So on the one hand, we want to raise the weights of different groups, especially groups that have tended to score lower so that it will equalize a little bit across the schools. The scores really, because the number of score, the weight of, let's say, at-risk students who tend to score lower will be equalized greatly across schools.
I don't want to directly say yes to that because I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding. And so when you have the all students group having such a high weight, which is 75% currently, the floors and the targets, which is what you use to determine the metric points that they earn at each one of those metrics. Those floors and targets are determined based upon the performance of all students in DC at that grade level. But when you look at the at-risk floor and target, then you're thinking about in a more relative comparison of how are just the at-risk students doing across DC in this grade span in this metric, and you're able to see how is this school supporting its at-risk students. And so when you're not having a 75% weight in a framework with a school that has a 65% at-risk population, if 75% of their weight is based on floors and targets that are determined by a large portion of students who are not at risk, that puts them at a disadvantage of being able to truly measure how they're supporting at an equitable weight those students. And so by decreasing the all students weight and increasing the at-risk or the low income or whatever name that we could come up with on that, the federally determined economically disadvantaged, which is what's in the statute, that allows us to better measure how schools are supporting students against those more bespoke targets, and then allows us to show improvement and close those gaps over time. So it's not really about equalizing it, but it's about being more equitable.
So in terms of the transparency, it's absolutely right. Like, and this is why I don't like the kind of the summative number. It's very important to be able to show at any given school, here's how our at-risk students are doing, and here's what the growth rate.
We do.
For at-risk. No, I'm saying that's
Yeah.
really important. That gets lost inside of a summative rating. You don't know what part is at-risk students growing or what part is at-risk students' initial scores or anything else. So what I'm saying is it's very important to know for all of us who are involved in school improvement, how schools are doing, to understand that detail. Because it's a super important, it's not even a detail, it's a very important fact. What I don't, but so that I get, if you start to do that as a formula, right, where you're coming out with one number, I'm not sure what it's, so what if, so let's take three schools. One school has, let's say 90% at-risk population, one has 50% at risk, and one has 8%.
Mm-hmm.
So at each of those schools, the scores of at-risk growth, let's just say, are going to be 40%. Or of, not just of every score of at-risk students will be 40%. Is that correct?
The weight applied to the overall metric score,
right,
based on the metric points earned within students at risk. If the weight were 40%, then that metric points earned would be weighted at 40% to get the total metric score.
So the weight of the student group becomes in some cases greater than the other students. I'm just trying to understand how that's going to affect the.
I think that's the question that I was asking,
Yeah.
which is how do these changes affect the equity component of this and making it equitable so that schools that serve high percentages of students designated at risk are getting credit for serving those students well?
Well, right. And what I'm saying is I want them to get credit for serving students well wherever they are. But if part of the point of this is to identify schools that need support, if you start to give, I can't get to the next part.
Okay.
I think what is helpful is, so oftentimes when people have historically looked at the report card, they've looked at the profile page and they saw the star rating on the profile page and didn't look any further.
Right.
If
That's
someone
right.
had actually looked at the star page, one of the things that you see there, and it's one of the things we actually walked through with the student advisory committee and a couple of other
Fun.
external groups, but we talked about how the student group scores are right there in the report card. And those student group scores are meaningful because not only do we have to use those when we identify our schools for targeted support and additional targeted support, but they tell you across the entire framework of metrics, how is this school supporting that individual student group? And then if you take a look at the individual metric, you're able to say, so for example, let's say we're looking at chronic absenteeism. You can look at chronic absenteeism, and if you look on the historic report card, you would see 7 different graphs. They were all, all graphs that showed you a floor and a target, and it said all students, and it showed you where the school was based on that floor and target. And then right below it, it showed you at risk, students with disabilities, in each race ethnicity group. And those were all right there in a single display. And you could see how are they doing compared to that floor and target.
I'm all over the displays. I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
but I
the
think
end
our
result
system
is a
actually-
number. I mean, for example, if you have a school where 8% of the students are at risk, for example, but that's not 40% of the score.
Correct.
So I actually want it to be on every school report card, how a school does serving its at-risk students. That's
Mhm.
really, really important. It should be very transparent. I'm for that being on page
Yep.
1. But when you start to say that the number in that school is now going to be 40% of that, even though there's only 8% of the students who are at risk, seems to me that this gets to equity in a different way, which is now is that school going to be in line to get extra assistance because they're going to end up with this? I mean, just
Well,
it's like-
that would assume that their overall score was in the bottom 5%, which would mean not only were they not supporting their at-risk students well, but they would not be supporting any of their students well.
And so what is it telling us that are looking at? Because we're just looking at this gross number. We don't know which part of it is making a score high or low.
I think that's where it's more than just looking at the total score. It's looking at everything that comes on the
I'm
page
for that.
before
The
it.
questions
Yeah.
are gonna, anyway,
Yeah.
I'm gonna come to Representative Lopez and then Representative Parker, and then see if any of our colleagues who are on Zoom have questions.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us. I have 3 really quick questions, and the first one is, if I remember well, you said you still have a couple of engagements to do.
Mhm.
So is there by any chance that I could recommend a group, or is that too late?
If we can get in with them, we'll try our very best. Just send it over via email, and we'll try to reach out to them.
Okay, and the next one is also very quick, relating back to the summative rating, and it's just a very quick clarification. If you were talking about having summative ratings, not specifically, the first thing that they see. Was this something that you were planning to do by category? If, first I were talking about attendance, was that something for attendance or just an overall score included with the 0 through 100?
So one thing I want to reemphasize, and it's something that I think Representative Patterson had asked about as well, is that overall score is different than a summative rating. So we are moving away from the single summative rating, but there will be a score. And so some of the feedback that we've heard is the way in which people would like to see that organized on the page is that they would like to see the components that go into that score kind of going down the page. We've also heard feedback, and I think you guys talked about this a little bit as well, in that there'd like to be some sort of combination of achievement or growth and say, hey, how's this school doing overall on achievement? And looking at some sort of description about that. That's also a display feature and thinking about, it's something you see on a lot of dashboards in terms of how does this look and what's this number look like? It's kind of similar to what we have on our report card now, where we have those tiles that tell you a little bit of the information of what's going on inside that area. But what we've heard overwhelmingly is that people want to see all the components that lead to that overall score, and a commitment that we are moving away from the single summative rating, but we do have an accountability calculation.
Thank you.
Representative Parker, last question.
Yes, that conversation, I think it's a positive development. As I see it, you're holding schools accountable to how they're moving our most vulnerable students. And the question I have is for that, 30 to 35%, let's say for at risk, Well, how is that value being determined beneath the 35%? And I know that it doesn't make sense, like the balance of proficiency and growth. And I know you were saying here on another slide, like you're setting nonlinear growth targets.
For access growth. So there's a couple things conflated. I'm gonna
Okay.
unscramble them.
Yes.
Okay. So student group weights happen when we calculate the overall metric score for calculation to an overall score.
Yes.
But the points that are assigned to the individual metrics. So for example, achievement or proficiency in ELA on the elementary and middle school framework is currently 10 points. Median growth percentile and growth to proficiency in ELA are each 10 points. So 20 points for ELA growth, 10 points for ELA proficiency. Those are metric points. That's different than the student group weights. That tells you how many points that metric is worth. In order to get that metric score,
Yes.
it's weighted based upon the performance of the student groups
That
within.
entire student group.
Yes.
So for that example, the 10, 10, 20 total, you would take all of those at-risk students and then 30 to 35% of the total school rating or number value would be.
For that metric score.
And I'll just share why I'm asking that. Just my experience with some schools that have high at-risk populations is that it often takes time for them to hit the proficiency or move the proficiency metric, although you see beneath the surface movement. And I was just trying to get a better grasp of how is that going to show up in that 30 to 35% weight, because I agree it is a good thing that we're holding schools accountable. We could talk offline because I know time is of the essence. That's what I'm trying to get a better grasp of that I don't think I'm understanding.
So for elementary and middle school, academic growth still has twice the weight of proficiency. That hasn't changed. The student group weight is more about the calculation of the overall score. The weight applied to the individual metric is the same. Academic growth worth twice as much as proficiency.
So just want to be mindful that we're now more than an hour on this topic, and we do have to get to attendance, and we do want to go home at some point. So I want to wrap us up. I found out through the magic of the internet that we don't have any questions from folks on Zoom. So I want to thank you, Ms. Johnson, for this really helpful update. We will follow up if there are additional questions. The one thing I want to say that I really appreciate is that it does appear that in the engagement and the feedback and the changes you're talking about making here, we're focused on two things: a more equitable accountability system and one that is honest about where our schools are in a given moment, serving the children who are in front of them. That I think matters a lot to stakeholders, and these questions about display and these questions about calculations certainly also matter. But if we can keep that bottom line at the forefront, that's going to be the most important thing, I think, for a lot of us to be able to say that that's what we care about. So I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We are going to move on to another guest from Aussie. We are glad to welcome Andrew Gall, Joseph Hood, and Justin Tooley from Aussie to lead us through suggested changes to the district's regulations governing attendance, including what Dr. O'Leary was hinting at, the definition of present, changing from 80-20 to 60-40, clarifying language related to truancy, and providing permanent guidance related to distance learning. As a reminder to representatives and the public, in 2015, the board adopted a report by then Ward 4 Representative Keneally Anderson that provided recommendations for changes to the state attendance regulations, including the change from 80-20. So we're very excited to have this conversation tonight. Thank you, gentlemen.
Right.
The floor is yours.
So, new role, I get to do less talking, which might be a good thing. But I want to tell you who these two new gentlemen are on our team. So we had to do a lot of hiring with the new superintendent, and as you know, in DC government, that takes a while. But not only I have some more help. So to my immediate right is Andrew Gall. He's the deputy chief of staff for legislative affairs and policy. He's filling the role that I previously had. So he does our work with the council, and also will lead a lot of our work with the state board. And then also to his right is Joseph Hood. He is a special assistant on our team, and he provides additional support to me, and also our deputy chief of staff and superintendent, sort of our utility player. So they are going to present for the first time to you, and we're going to see how this goes. And so it'll be great.
Well, welcome. We're glad to have you.
Thank you so much. Definitely pleased to be here and to meet all of you and everybody on Zoom. Hello. So try to go through this a little bit quickly because I know we had a lot of questions on the
We
last
always
round.
have a lot of questions, Andrew.
They do that.
We do.
So our objective today is simply to present and obtain feedback on our emergency proposed regulation to codify attendance collection for procedures for the upcoming school year. So broadly, our agenda, I will set sort of the legal background of how things exist now, and then Joseph will go into a little bit deeper outlining the concepts for our change. So first, just level setting on attendance as a concept. So what is attendance? It's the authentication of a student's presence for the purpose of safety and welfare. It is meaning that students are where they are expected to be on a particular day, and it means that student is exposed to education. One thing that you'll see that we'll go into further is that how we traditionally think about attendance is a little bit different under remote learning setting. So just something to keep in mind, a student doesn't go to a physical building. So when we're trying to define attendance, get to think about that. And unlike for in-person learning, the direct supervision of the student does not change. So the school does not become in charge. And another thing is that distance learning or remote learning can be delivered both synchronously, meaning the teacher is speaking at the same time as the student is listening, or asynchronously. And so just going to run through some of the legal background. As I mentioned, there are 4 players to keep in mind that are bound by law when we're talking about attendance. So one is Aussie, who we're representing. So we collect and report data on attendance by law. We promulgate rules on that govern the attendance, and we provide reporting requirements. State Board of Education, you all obviously know that you approve the state rules, the regulations for enforcing school attendance. There's also LEAs and schools, so they have a role as well. They are to record the attendance every single day. They have to report that to Aussie and make publicly available the data on attendance, and they're required to report truant students to the relevant agencies. Finally, there are parents and students. So attendance is compulsory under the law for students aged 5 until 18, and the absence of a minor without an excuse is unlawful. So those are the statutes. Now going into the regulations. So going through the main ones that we're looking at to potentially amend. So well, that exist right now. So they exist under 5A DCMR in section 2100 primarily. So that's what I'll run through now. So each education institution must maintain accurate records for attendance. That's 2101.1. 2101.3. A complete attendance record has certain components that they need to include, including present and absent. So that is relevant to what we are talking about today, and excused and unexcused. And I know this is probably a review for some of you, so apologies, but want to make sure we lay that legal background. But educational institutions have to have an attendance monitor. So every school has a monitor, and then the regulation lays out certain responsibilities for them. In addition, at the end of the year, 60 days after the end of the year, all that data, all the attendance data has to be submitted to us. Going on to the next slide. Educational institutions have to send a letter to the student's parent and to Aussie, notifying of unexcused absence and that the student may be in violation of attendance laws. Also, Aussie sends a truancy guide when we get that letter to the student and the family. And then 2102 sets out that you need to have that you are presumed not to have an excuse if unless one is given, sets out a few excuses. You have to report any excused absences within 5 days of coming back to school. And educational institutions must publish that information on their website, including what constitutes an excused absence. And then the last main regulation in the realm of attendance is 2103. And this sets out the SST process as required by statute. So that's sort of the background of what we are looking at when we're talking about changing our attendance regulations. And Joseph here will go into some of the more details that we're looking at changing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew, and thank each of you for being here and having us here. I'm going to start by just kind of laying out the scope of our proposed regulatory shifts. There are kind of three key areas that we're looking at as we're talking about this shift. The first being shifting the definition of present from the current 80-20 rule to the 60-40 rule. As Representative O'Leary referenced earlier, for those of you who might need some reminder, whether online, in public, et cetera, this comes from the recent hearing in council where there was actually legislation discussed that would require Aussie to change from the 80-20 to the 60-40. This is our response. This is our proposal to actually move in that direction at council's encouragement. Second piece being clarifying language regarding refers for truancy. This clarification is on the language around full day unexcused. Essentially, there is just some misalignment of definitions in that language, and this is just some cleanup. It's not changing actual definitions or usage. It's just cleaning up the language, making it a little bit more clear and getting rid of some of that duplicative languages currently in our refers for truancy. The third piece is, in which we'll probably go the most in-depth to this evening in our presentation, is codifying the parameters for collecting daily attendance in distance learning. This is a reflection on recognizing the new world that we are in when it comes to education and the changes and shifts that we've seen therein. Moving on to slide number 9. Before we get further, we just want to level set on key terminology, and we found it helpful to kind of think of it in kind of 2 buckets when we're talking about distance education and the direction that we're trying to move things in. The first piece being routine distance learning, and the second piece being actually situational. In this routine bucket, I'm about to go through each of these definitions just so that we'll make sure that we're clear on them, is distance learning, virtual schools, and hybrid learning. So when we're talking about routine distance learning, this is academic instruction offered by a district LEA to a student that is not physically present in their enrolled school, where student supervision is not transferred to the school. This distance learning may be synchronous or asynchronous or a hybrid, which is a mix of both. The second piece is virtual schools. This is our term for schools offering distance learning on a routine full-time basis. The third is hybrid learning, which is academic instruction offered by a district LEA to a student that is offered through both in-person and distance learning on a routine basis. And this idea of routine is extremely important. This is not what we're about to go into, which is the situational piece. Situational distance learning, we define as the use of distance learning by a school otherwise providing in-person instruction on a routine basis to address a temporary emergency need. So when you think about in January, when we had the Omicron surge and the closures that would happen at some schools, campuses in the district, and other campuses did not experience that, and they continue to provide learning from that remote posture, that's what we would call situational distance learning. And then a module, which we will go into much more detail on this, we actually have a mock-up that you can see in a few minutes, is a subdivision or unit of the instructional day for distance learning. This is how we're actually operationalizing many of the requirements that we have of schools for distance learning when it comes to attendance. And then I want to pause here very quickly on this terminology, just to make sure that we're on the same page if there are any questions on that.
I have a clarifying
Yes,
question. I remember a couple of years ago, there was a situation with a student who was chronically ill, consistently hospitalized, receiving ongoing treatment. How does that fall in here? Is that a distance learning posture, a situational distance learning posture?
So neither. So there's a body of law and regulation protecting the home and hospital instruction. So when a student like breaks an arm, or if a student has some sort of like really bad disease that keeps them to school, there's a whole different body of we're actually promulgating rules around that too. Is like the access to home and hospital instruction. That's a separate body of.
And does not count in these attendance definitions. Fantastic.
Wait, I have a follow-up question into that. So then is that their home or hospital considered their own like placement?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I just had a question about hybrid learning. If students are doing hybrid learning asynchronously because their school is in person and does not have synchronous lessons, does that count as hybrid learning, or does that count as something else? Like, let's say I was out sick or I had COVID, so it was situational, but my school didn't offer synchronous classes, just packets of work or something like that. Would I be considered a hybrid student, or is that something separate?
That would be the situational distance.
Okay. Oh, I have one more question. I'm
Yes.
sorry.
No worries. This is what we're
I'm
doing.
guessing this is going to come up when we talk about the module,
Yes.
but I know there's also been talk about schools that offer particular courses, being able to offer that as distance learning to students who are not in their building. Would that count as a module of distance learning?
I believe that the short answer is it's student to student, and it would depend on the respective situation for that student or for that particular population of students. But it sounds to me as if you're describing a hybrid learning situation, but we can get more into those questions when we actually look at the model.
So this is evolving. So one of the interesting things about distance learning is that it's a fast place. It's like when you start looking at people come to us, to Aussie, with a whole bunch of ideas. One being, like, let's say, I think for Sutter's example was, okay, one LEA offers music theory, AP music theory, but another LEA doesn't. They have students that want to take music theory. So is there a way that you can use distance learning to make sure that there's more music theory for everybody?
Yep.
So
that's exactly my question.
This is not something in place right now, but our distance learning regulations would grow and to go in that direction to accommodate those needs. Because there might be places where those kids go to an in-person school and just log on for a particular class period. There might be a place where those students are actually in distance learning, but that's going to be an evolving space.
Excited.
I'm excited too.
Glad to hear.
Always count on the students to be excited about innovation.
We appreciate that. Any additional final questions just on the terminology and just making sure that we're very clear on that? We will of course handle broader questions on what we're proposing at the end of our presentation. Great. Hearing none. So we want to begin when we're talking about these key areas and grounding ourselves in the existing regulations. Aussie has the power to define the instructional day, and I just want to ground us in what we're talking about for the instructional day for the coming school year, 22-23. First, there are a series of existing policies that we're going to be maintaining for all schools, including distance and hybrid schools. That includes the fact that the school year is comprised of at least 180 regular instructional days of at least 6 hours in length for all students. Students are about to be very excited. The 6 hours may include time allotted for lunch periods, recess, and class breaks. So that's cumulative. So if you go to lunch, you have time between periods that counts for those 6 hours. That counts toward those 6 hours. Aussie must review and approve all school calendars. And Aussie offers school calendar flexibility, such as the selection of the days when school is in session, waivers on half days when schools can choose to have a half day once per week, as well as additional calendar modifications as proposed by LEAs. Now, as we're looking towards new flexibility for managing unforeseen circumstances, this is something that we're excited about. This is something that we're excited to share with LEAs and with you. First, there's the general idea of when a school faces an unforeseen circumstance, the school is now going to have two options. First being close the school, right? And I think that this is what we've been used to traditionally when you think of things such as a snow day, or when you think of exigent circumstances that are in line with the existing policy. And currently under the policy, if your school has calendared more than 180 days and 1,080 hours, they can bank that away. We have used, for example, if my school has 1,300 hours of instruction time in our calendar and 183 days of instructional days in our calendar, and we need to take one day and just close school, there's nothing else that they don't need to make up that time because they have more than what is required by Aussie under the 180-day, 1,080 hour requirement. However, if your school is under that 180-day threshold and those 1,080 hours, they can close the school, but they would have to be required to make up that day. This is policy that's longstanding, that has existed. It's policy that will continue into the future. What we are providing as an additional flexibility that we are proposing is that every school will be able to convert to distance learning without asking approval from Aussie up to 5 days. And so we're calling those a bank of 5 distance learning days, and they can use that LEAs and schools can use at their discretion and to determine when those days should be used in response to unforeseen circumstances instead of closing the school. So an LEA can move to remote situational learning, situational distance learning. These days are intended for unforeseen circumstances only, such as a snow day or a COVID surge, and they may not be built into the calendar at the start of the year. So that is what we saw during the Omicron surge of a school says, we cannot operate today because X number of teachers are out. We're going to move to a situational remote distance learning day where services will continue to be provided to students, but from a remote posture. And LEAs can go up to 5 days without having to come to Aussie for permission of that. Now, that's where we get to waivers. To reduce below the 180 day or 10,080 hour or 1,080 hour threshold, or convert more than 5 days of situational distance learning, that's when the LEA would seek a waiver from Aussie. And these waivers would be granted only in exigent circumstances or in events of like a massive health catastrophe, God forbid. Aussie would be granting, as we have in the past, citywide relief waiver for catastrophic circumstances. So that's what we're proposing. That's what we're moving towards when we're discussing the instructional day. Would we prefer to take questions now? Yeah, it's going to do it. Yeah. Okay, great.
This
Yeah.
is an easy one.
Yeah.
So you talk about every school will have a bank of these 5 distance learning days. So 2 things. One, to me, and then you talk about LEA. So right now, LEAs in effect have a bank they call a snow day. But are you saying that now the school itself, separate from the LEA, can say my school and the principal does it? Just the LEA allows it?
So yes, so this is a really good question. So sometimes an LEA, when it snows in DC, the chancellor says, the mayor says, there's no school for DCPS in its entirety, right? But then what we saw during the Omicron surge is that one school needed to close due to their circumstances, but another one didn't. And we want to make sure that they can do that on a school level basis instead of to avoid closing a large scale closure. That's what
So they would they'd get approval from their LEA, but they would do it at the school level.
Yes, that would be the mechanics. The principal, that would be, the LEA would need to figure out their process.
Good idea.
Thank you.
I'm just saying my opinion about snow days, but I believe in snow days.
Me too.
And COVID days, and I don't want them to be a thing of the past. So I just want to register that I believe in snow days for human beings.
I do too, seriously.
Yeah.
No,
Take
that
under-
was not in jest. Like,
Right.
well, I guess there's always some truth in jest, but
Right.
I meant that.
Can I ask one other question about the selection of days? This is something I am unaware of, and I want to make sure I understand it. Does this mean if I wanted my school to be a Monday to Thursday school, I could apply for a calendar that was a Monday to Thursday school? Okay, cool. That is helpful to know. I know various LEAs are talking about ways to structure time for teacher flexibility, et cetera. And so that is helpful to know that that is a existing flexibility.
It is. They can pick the days, but they would still need to be 180. So they're going to be going in June, July, whenever.
Yep.
Still 180.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, it's the days and the hours.
Yes. You still got to beat that for the entire.
Is there any accountability for those distance learning days, those 5 days that are banked? So school,
How would
Hey.
we track it? Is that what you're asking?
yeah, or is there a threshold of students that actually need to log on or engage?
No, there isn't that. What we require is, so every, sorry guys. Every school builds a calendar, every LEA, every school builds a calendar. And then when there are changes to the calendar, you gotta send that to us. So we're able to track, we keep track of the time that they're scheduled. That also is foundational, although it's outside of our attendance policy. This is actually really important because it's what is a foundational piece of our data systems is like if you're sending us attendance data for a day your school's not open, we would say error like that, like you can't do that. You didn't have school that day. Or if you're sitting like, so it's foundational to that. We would be able to track like, oh, that school has already used 5, or that's what or et cetera, et cetera.
And I imagine these examples here, COVID or snow day are just examples.
Yes.
So-
Those are just examples.
Got it.
I mean, real talk, we did have, there's
Like a
some,
school
there's
had a
sometimes.
traumatic incident and wants to
Yeah.
provide
Yes.
counseling. maybe
There's
this
Oh,
day.
sometimes
100%.
when things happen in your Ward 6, like around the Capitol,
Yes.
schools are impacted. So this stuff happens.
It was not a nice day.
No.
No.
That was not a nice day.
So that does happen often. But it's important that those don't have to always be a request from us, because it's just too much.
And those would also apply if there was like an issue with the building.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, pipe bursts.
And that happens often.
Yeah.
I have a elephant in the room question. During the COVID times, when we were all online, a lot of students never showed their face.
What? You're getting ahead of us.
Yeah.
You want to continue forward?
Yes. As long as we're,
Thank you for your patience.
no, absolutely. Helpful questions.
A
We
lot of
appreciate
great
it.
information.
Now, when we want to zoom in a little bit now to these, as we've already begun into situational distance learning. So these are when we talk about those 5 banked distance learning days, and this is in relation to attendance and how we're keeping track of student attendance. And then also that broader idea, the waiver is provided from Aussie to beyond those 5 banked learning days. So if there's an additional need for situational distance learning at a particular school or district-wide or a particular LEA, these are the kind of 2 situations that we're talking about. We're not discussing full-time virtual schools right now. So for situational distance learning, all LEAs will apply a 2-part test when they're talking about student attendance. The first part being physical presence. So each instructional day in a situational distance learning posture must include a check for the student's presence and verification of the student's identity during the day. This can occur through some kind of LMS authentication, one-on-one contact with the student, or physically seeing the student on screen. The second part is daily completion of an instructional task. Students must demonstrate daily engagement with at least 1 planned instructional activity. Approved activities could include graded or ungraded assignments, assessments, or other submission of some completed work product. Essentially just verifying that the student did do and participate in a situational distance learning day. Now, for days marked as situational distance learning, LEAs must immediately mark the day as situational distance in their school day calendar and validate it in accordance with the relevant data validation policies for that school year. That gets to Representative Parker's question of how we're actually operationalizing this, as well as document and preserve records for attendance representing both parts of the two-part test in case of an audit. So in case we're auditing attendance, making sure that there was actually situational distance learning happening that day, the school would have to have documentation and preservation of those records. Okay. Moving on to where we're talking about the new territory, which is attendance for routine distance learning. When we're actually talking about, and I want to ground us here in the fact that this is new and the fact that we have not done this before and is actually pretty new when we're looking nationally. We've done national conversation. We've looked nationally at what other places are doing, and we're getting an idea of when we were to inform our own decision that we're making here. And this is relatively new fact. The first element being the actual structure of that instructional day. So we're on slide 12 now for those of you who are following that. LEAs must divide their instructional day into learning modules with the following parameters. This is our proposal. The LEAs determine the number of modules in a day, the length of time of the module, and the content covered in that module. Also, the LEA must identify whether the module is synchronous or asynchronous, and at least one module per day must be synchronous for every student. I'm sure some of you have questions about this, but we have a walkthrough of a kind of a mock-up, and I think it'd be better to see the mock-up and then we can answer questions as we walk through that. So that's the first element of our proposal for routine distance learning when we're considering attendance for these students. The second element is actually defining present for the instructional day. So to be considered present in the synchronous model, a student must be visually present. So camera on, identified, verified by instructor. As a reminder, this is different than what we were talking about for the situational. This is routine. And so we're actually requiring or proposed to require camera and students being verified on camera so that we can actually say that student is present. To be considered present in the asynchronous model, a student must complete an output for the content covered in that module. We are intentionally vague about how we define output because there are a lot of different things that a educator might be asking of their student during that asynchronous time. But it's very similar to what we ask for the situational distance learning in terms of the completion of an instructional task. So when we're looking at a module, for a student to be considered present, there has to be completion of some kind of output. And part of the reason we're doing this is to operationalize the 60-40 rule when we're considering attendance for students who are full-time remote. And to be counted as present for the day, a student must be marked present in the modules that account for at least 60% of the instructional day, and they must attend at least one synchronous module. The requirement for one synchronous module is, again, just to confirm that the student is there and that you get a visual confirmation that the student is where they are supposed to be for that day. In addition, procedurally, LEAs offering distance learning must provide their distance learning attendance policy to Aussie for approval. They must publicly share their attendance policy in writing with families, and they must document and preserve records for both synchronous and asynchronous attendance. Now, I think we can move to 13 and we can look at this module, and I think that's a good spot to stop for any questions, or we can go to next steps and then go into questions. I'm agnostic as to the direction that we go.
But maybe looking at the example would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So this would be an example of a schedule that an LEA could or a school could submit for a student. And you'll look and you'll see that we've conveniently broken it into 6 hours. 6 hours here. And that we have 5 modules of instruction with a 1 hour lunch break. Now, I know that many students might not get a 1 hour lunch break, but it's the same way that we have a 6 hour instructional day. This is how you capture the 6 hour instruction day in a virtual remote setting. And you'll see in module 1 in their schedule is a synchronous module. Module 2 is asynchronous, 3 asynchronous, 4 synchronous, and 5 asynchronous. Now, this model our example has 2 synchronous. Reminder, we're only requiring 1 synchronous module. Now, so let's say the student comes to school, quote unquote, they log on, what it might be. And in the first period, they are seen on the camera for their module and they are marked present. So they're present for that first module. In module 2, it's asynchronous. That student completes that activity. For example, it could be a check for an understanding or a quiz or a worksheet, whatever that might be. And that student is marked present for that second module. In module 3, which is asynchronous, the student does not complete any type of output activity, and they would be marked absent for that module. Number 4, it's a synchronous module. The student does not appear on camera during that module. They would be marked absent. And then 5, the asynchronous module, the student completes the output activity that's present. So if my math is correct, that is 3 of the 5 modules, they were considered present. That is 60%. So the student is counted as present partial because they've attended 60% of the instructional day and they were present on camera for at least 1 synchronous module. And so this is how we're actualizing the 60-40 rule, making sure that this LEAs are providing the services that they've committed to provide to students in the district in a virtual posture. I will pause there.
There's a question online.
Yes, but yeah, one thing to remember too, I think, is that I don't know if we covered this in the beginning. Can you talk about a little bit about sort of before times distance learning, and there's no attendance policy on distance learning. I don't think we have that.
Right now, this is an unregulated space.
Yeah.
So we're simply trying to come up with guardrails that will accommodate for existing models, but that don't have the bars too high to like stifle innovation, but don't have them too low where we're not able to actually track attendance. So
Yeah.
that's sort of the conceptual frame.
There's a question online from Dr. Gasoy, and she has to leave the meeting early apparently. So Dr. Gasoy?
Thanks so much. And thank you so much for this work you're doing. I appreciate how complicated all of this is. I actually have two questions. One's a clarification on the need for students to be on camera. I think what you're saying is the teacher needs to know that they are present. So for example, if there's a student who has a disability or condition, whether it's situational or ongoing, that would make it hard for them to actually be on camera. Would they be able to be counted present if they were able to verify with the teacher in another way that they were there?
So for situational distance, they don't actually necessarily have to be, it's a different standard than the routine distance. So if you look back on slide 11, was it?
9.
This
Well-
module is routine distance.
Yes, routine distance, yes, ma'am.
It's a little bit broader, so it could be verified through an LMS authentication or one-on-one contact with the student. So for that situational distance that you were talking to, there is a little bit more flexibility.
Yes,
But if
to,
it's, yeah, go on.
yes, but to the second part of your question, yes, we are asking for visual confirmation that the student is where they are supposed to be.
Okay, and does that have, so I'm thinking, for instance, I know there are some students who have autism, for example, who, that is a very challenging situation, or students who even are in a environment where it's problematic for them to have their camera on. Are there ways for those students to verify their presence in other ways, or is that's a fast and fixed rule at this point?
No, well, I guess I have a thought. So like, I would assume since virtual learning was an unregulated space, there's probably also a need as we look at student 504 and student IEPs to have explicit accommodations, which is different than like the standard is you should turn the camera on so we know you are present.
Right.
But I would assume that there are those things like that are also not built in because it was an unregulated space and not a standard.
Sure. Let me take a stab at this. So one, this is actually something we have not thought about that much. This is exactly why we do stakeholder engagement. So I think this is a place of one, in a full distance learning, we feel quite strongly that a school, an instructor, needs to have some eyeballs on kids for the purposes of safety and welfare and how to do that. The duration, we're agnostic to, but we do believe that visible chat is very important. The other thing too is that I will connect with our special education team on this particular question about how, because that's what going forward in my regulation, maybe there's some language that we need to have to finesse that the right way to make sure that it's covered under these situations. And I think that's something we can definitely. And too, with our rulemaking, like we go through legal sufficiency, like with our general counsel, and they flag those things for us. So describe those things as we go.
Can I ask? Oh, yeah.
Go ahead, Dr. Gasoy.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if, I know this is kind of still in the works. Has there been communication already with families and students? Is this something you want representatives to share out with our constituents? Yeah, what has the engagement been so far?
There have been a few different engagements that we have done. We've talked with DCPS, we've talked to the public charter school board president. We've talked with multiple LEAs. So we've talked with both LEA leaders and LEA administrators in focus groups to get feedback from them, and have talked with sister agencies and have spoken with advocate organizations. So there's been a number of stakeholder engagements. We have not done a parent-specific one, so that's something that maybe we can consider, but we also want to make sure that we are getting this to you guys in time to get it through, but that is something that we can think about.
Yeah. We did hold an open call for all LEAs, and we'll be presenting again many of these things to LEAs very soon. But our focus groups were specifically open to all LEAs, and what we found in that engagement is the folks who are interested in that conversation were the folks who were either already doing virtual learning in the district or very interested in doing so. So it's kind of very niche in that sense. There are plenty of LEAs in the district that have no interest in engaging in that space at the moment because it's not a direction they're looking at going into. And so what we found is the LEAs who are either already engaging in it or interested in it have been very active in conversations with us. And we've taken that into account. You could ask them and they could say, what we're presenting to you today looks very different from conversations we were even having a few weeks ago prior to talking with them.
I want to back up one level before I come to other member comments. So I'm seeing that Aussie's here making requests for schedule approval. But right now, as I understand it, there are only 3 LEAs in the district that are authorized to even use routine distance learning. Is that still open that LEAs can apply to offer routine distance learning?
Well,
I think that'll eliminate some questions that might otherwise come up.
so let's do a little history. So this year we had a medical certification process. So students that had a medical need due to COVID, their homeschool, whether it was not a distance learning school or not, had they still provided distance learning to those kids, right? Then there was a set of schools. There was one, Friendship Online had done online learning before the pandemic. So before, we'll continue to do this before. Then the PCSB did authorize a program at KIP for distance learning that looks a little bit differently than Friendships. And we talked to both of them. We are under the impression that there will be other LEAs that are interested, not that many, but yes, if they are a public charter school, they would need to be authorized by the authorizer to have an online program.
And so that would be the process, that they would go to PCSB to get authorization to operate a routine distance learning program and then would do the schedule approval process.
Our statewide.
Got it. Thank you for that. Okay, member questions. Dr. O'Leary, Representative Bernstad, Representative Reed, Representative Thompson, and then Representative Wattenberg.
So I'm back to the elephant in the room. This is all interesting because for the first time I see where Aussie is putting out regulations, which is good as far as I'm concerned. The elephant in the room I was talking about I know I prefaced it as far as distance learning, but it really, besides the fact that students weren't turning on their cameras, that's not, this past school year, which has been almost all live learning. From what I'm hearing from the people that I've talked to, educators and principals, is that there are a lot of students that the regulations in DCPS are, if your class is over at 10 o'clock and you show up at 9:59, you're considered present. And it seems to me that, does Aussie have any control over the defining what is present and what is absent for the LEAs in real live learning? And if not, I guess that I would strongly recommend that you do that, because a lot of students, as we know, the students, once they found out that they didn't have to be on camera, students are much smarter than a lot of people, period. And a lot of students have really taken advantage of the rules, which state that if you are a live body at 9:59, you're present. And so that the attendance, the real attendance, in-seat attendance is skewed. And I was wondering if y'all could work on unskewing it, if there's such a word as that. And I guess I'm asking you, Justin, as far as, because this to me looks like for where you set up a really good set of guidelines for virtual learning. But right now we don't really have a virtual learning problem as much as we have a real attendance problem. I don't know, I can't speak for I can speak for DCPS. I can't speak for DCPS, but I know that I've heard it with a lot of DCPS people. And is that something that is in Aussie's, because I'm always trying to give Aussie more power. Is that something in Aussie's purview that as far as attendance is concerned, especially going into this, because 60-40 is not a virtual learning rule. 60-40 is a school rule. So I'm just wondering if that's a possibility.
So I think there's a lot there. So let's start with where we were with the pandemic. Is that we had this once, hopefully in a generation, lifetime pandemic that required us to shift learning, right? And schools we didn't have a battle plan of how to take all of our in-person learning to distance learning. So we had to figure out, like by duct tape, how to make that shift. And so we did not have really robust policies for distance because like schools did not have the capacity. So yes, what you described happened because a lot of kids had to go, whether they liked to or not, whether their parents wanted them to go, we made them for a period of time go to a distance learning, online learning setting and sort of build that back up. I think what we're trying to do is to for in-person schools that are switching to situational distance to limit that. It's like to keep the number of times you can do that low. So that's why you see like the bank 5-day policy is to make sure that you're not doing that 15 times a year or 20 times a year or whatever like that. So that's one way that we're trying to guard against it. I think this issue around so that sort of turning your camera on, turning your camera off, we're really trying to get through that. Definitely on the routine distance learning, full distance learning schools, but for the situational pieces by really putting guardrails around situational distance learning itself. It's like it needs to happen. Brief, rare, keep schools open to the most as possible. There might be some places where you do have operational flexibility. You've got some of that, but if you need more, you're going to come to us. We're going to ask questions. The other piece on sort of in-person attendance, I think you all figured out like I talk a lot about attendance and have to do a lot of the attendance type issues. I think that we do have a massive attendance problem. I think that we're seeing not only kids, this issue around 80, 20, and 60, 40, I think it's important, but what we are still seeing in the data is that most kids don't come to school at all. It's like when truancy is as high as it is, and that's full day unexcused absences, to me, I think it's a little unsettling because those are kids that you don't see at all and you don't have any excuse for them. That means the school didn't have anything. And those are the things we're trying to really
Good. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. O'Leary. Representative Bernstadt.
Okay, I'll try to keep this brief because I know there's still like a bunch more slides. This is more of a concern comment, and I'm sure it'll turn into a question. Actually, no, there is a question. Yes, I see one. Okay. So can turning the camera on for synchronous attendance for fully virtual schools, could that be private, i.e. like in a Zoom breakout room? Because otherwise some concerns arise for me. And I know that this happened when my school was fully virtual last year and partially virtual when COVID struck, it became fully virtual. Because some students just don't want to have their camera on in front of the class. For some students, I'd rather not be in the Zoom at all. I know I've been in lessons where teachers have asked students to turn their camera on in front of the entire class and they just leave the Zoom. Mm-hmm. So would it be possible to have that, like turning a camera on, be something separate that's not in front of the whole class, or would that have to be having the camera on for the entire class?
So there's no prohibition on like having it in a breakout room, like you said. It's just that the teacher needs to visually verify. So that's that's within the realm of possibility. Also, one thing to keep in mind is that this is an opt-in situation, so like nobody would be forced to go to a fully virtual school. So if you're not comfortable, you probably wouldn't sign up for it. But
So last year for you, I mean, I'm assuming you liked going to your in-person school and like your distance learning because of the pandemic, right? And so but this is a place where you are subscribed, like your parents are putting you in a distance learning school to serve you better. And we're like, that's a different instructional environment for you where we're like, no, being a part of a distance learning school means having your camera on because you're not going to physically.
Yeah.
So it is a harder line. And if that's a discomfort, then maybe the choice around distance learning might not be right.
But yes, I don't mean to sound like negative, but some students really don't have that choice. One, like I know when I moved schools, it was not my choice. I did not really get to choose where I went to school. But also like students who are immunocompromised, who have family members who are immunocompromised, it's not really a choice to opt into distance learning if it's the only option you have to stay healthy. And that's the only like issue that I foresee about equity is that like, well, yes, technically you're opting into the school. If you are immunocompromised and it's not just a situational instance, you don't really have the option to just opt out or only be doing virtual school for some of the time. So yeah, that was my only thing, is just concerns about time. And like, even if you opt into school, like, especially in high school, like you might not want to have your house and yourself on display for everyone in your class at all times. It's not necessarily always like the most comfortable thing. But yeah, that was just my comment.
We've also heard a little bit about this on surveillance. Like, I mean, it's a form of surveillance, and people were like, there's that discomfort, right? But we still believe that in distance learning, there needs to be visual eyes on students, and how that's done, agnostic, but we still believe that it's an important piece to have on people.
Thank you, Representative Bernstein. Dr. Reed.
I agree with what Mrs. Burns said. Great point about virtual and what students experience. So yes, I guess. I'll start with one piece of it is the time. So often schools are just having an attendance person, like the amount of time that especially like schools that might have more students who are absent, the amount of time spent on tracking down students. Could you just, all my questions are gonna be kind of like things I've heard from schools, so that's where I'm coming from. Does this speak to anything about like alleviating some of that burden? I mean, I know it's the school's job to kind of make sure students are okay, but I mean, a lot of it's like all of it, so. Adjust that.
I'm going to do this one. So this is a place where we should probably have a discussion because so one is schools have to have through the reg, they have to have a function, but like you also can't like spin through a regulation, right? Like, you can't add personnel and things like that.
Can you talk a little louder?
Oh, yes, of course. I can't spend money through a regulation. Like I can't build up 8 FTEs on attendance through a regulation. So this would be the appropriate vehicle for that. But I think that is a very good point that there are some schools that have a lot of have more attendance challenges than others. And so have like tracking students and finding students and reaching out to families is a bigger conversation. A little outside the scope of this, but I think there's some merit to that. Yeah, I can't spend FTE money on direct.
Okay, well, I just want to know.
Don't have that much power.
Gotcha. I just wanted to know if this impacts that at all. Okay, I can see another question that comes from the school is, what about the student, like the technical, maybe not from the school, maybe for the teacher, the whole technology aspect of it. The LE didn't do their job of getting me my hotspot or my actual device. How does that play into? Or I think that was like what kind of exactly talking about, well, accountability, not accountability, oversight.
You know, have their own device.
Yeah, I think that goes.
Especially for situational.
Yes,
like
okay.
My whole school. And then also another piece of that is, how do you factor in, like, I don't want in my head 50 kids in a Zoom just because they really need to shut down. See, like Representative Thompson said about like, sometimes you just need to close it, where it's like all maybe 5 teachers at COVID, and that's a whole grade level, and
Right.
it's not gonna be called instruction. How is that factored into this?
I think there are several questions there. The first question that I'm hearing is around what are we expecting of schools when they move to a situational distance learning posture? Are we setting hard, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but are we setting hard expectations on what that day looks like or what that day doesn't look like for those students? The short answer to that is no, we are not setting hard expectations of what that looks like, but we are standing up for the next school year. We're continuing our continuous education plans. And one of the aspects in our continuous education plans that we will be asking of LEA is some questions around capacity. So what is your one-to-one device ratio currently? What is, what are your plans of if my school were to go into a situational distance learning posture for whatever the reason is, what is that LEA's actual plan? And so we will be requiring that LEAs answer some questions to that effect. And those questions will be published for every LEA on their website as is required by us, by Aussie, and also by federal law.
That's so well.
Yes.
And I want to stop one more piece. And to kind of what Representative earlier speaking about, because I was at the high school for community meeting, and actually my council member who introduced 60/40 spoke about this really briefly. And I had a parent on one side and a dean on the other, behavior actually on the other side. And the immediate response was, we already give them until 10/20. And I'm just saying, that's what I heard. So kind of that whole piece about like, I wonder, like, are there other models, or is it 60/40 adjusting the time component, the right move? Because what I've heard from them was like, that's already a huge chunk of time that they're giving to allow students, even if the reason is like, I gotta drop off my brother and sister at Hart or Simon, which start at 8:05, 8:45, and they have until 10:20. So you speak to like, is this 60/40? Is this like a ratio move, or is like the other states are doing? Is there another way to do it? Just because that's a concern from that.
Yeah. So 80/20 has been on the minds of constituents. And I think when we did set a higher bar than most jurisdictions, that was established
With 80/20.
with the 80/20, yes. And I think that has been the impetus of this. I think a lot of the impetus of the shift was also about that it disincentivizes kids. Like if if I'm not there by X amount of time, there's no reason for me to come. And I think that there's some validity to that. I think the one time that I've been we do not collect course level attendance. This is a place where hopefully we will grow our capacity over time. But the thing is like where I have seen course level attendance, you do see some self-selection in courses. To me, in my ideal world, I'm like, well, I don't really trust a 16-year-old to make those choices of that math isn't important in English, but like in the real world, it totally happens, right? But so the 80/20/60/40 shift, I think if it helps kids get into the building and people are responsive to that, I say go do it, because at the end of the day, I think what we need to be worried about as a city is that students, far too many students aren't coming for 80, they're not coming for 60, they're not coming for 40, and you don't have any reason not.
Which we'll touch on,
Which is true.
At 10/20.
Yeah. And referrals for truants are a full day on excuse that.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Representative Thompson.
Yeah, I mean, so I have a couple separate thoughts. My first thought actually picks up where you just left off. So I'm super opposed to 80/20. I think we need to do away with it. I have listened to people over the years complain about how it actually penalizes and disincentivizes students to show up for attendance. I also, and I make no, I can do better, but I'm not shy about the fact that I am a late person at heart. And quite frankly, if you're telling me it's not worth anything if I show up, then I might as well just go into my next thing. And I know that should not be the way people approach the world, but we have to be honest about the incentives we create. And if we want to encourage students to go to the building, it's better if I get credit for that piece of the day, because then I'm actually going to show up. I do think it's also really important when we think about what schools are dealing with and how we respond to populations who are dealing with more. Like, you want to separate out the late Ebony Road from like the Valicia Road. So like I represent Ward 7, the shelter was in Ward 7. When I think about virtual schools pre-pandemic, and I used to actually work for an organization that put a lot of, our focus was actually high school dropouts. Virtual schools largely are not traditional students, like in the national context pre-pandemic. These are students who like maybe, I don't know, I'm not in school every day because I have children. I'm not in school every day because I might be on house arrest, I'm incarcerated, like these types of things. And quite frankly, the data has shown that because they are populations that are more, have a lot more challenges, a lot of times schools are not serving them well. I think it's actually really important that we regulate virtual learning and attendance. So a move to say, okay, here's our expectations, and you can't just get a per pupil allocation. You're not gonna just get $12,000 for a student that we don't know if you've ever seen is really important. So I applaud that accountability. I also think that, again, we want to make sure we're providing the right incentives and we're making sure people are focused on the right groups of students when it comes to attendance policy. I understand that at the LEA level, this will not discourage them from, again, collecting like the course level data. So like, I still know if I'm in attendance house. My sister actually was in attendance house for several years. Like she was that person who called her student, text her student, and these were elementary school kids, made sure they got to school all the same. Those things won't be removed. Those things aren't disincentivized from an LEA perspective because you still have accountability at the school level for attendance. But what it does do is for individual students, they're willing to say, you know what, I'm going to show up for the rest of my day and get counted for. And I think that's really important. I also have heard, just from the last one for right now, I also have heard that from principals, high school principals who are considering the DCPS redesign, one of the things that came up for them was when they were told to think outside of the box, they were actually really afraid to change some of their scheduling practices, because it is super possible that if you miss a period and you have a certain block, that's already, you have missed 20% of your day, and therefore it's not counted. And so that then they were like, instead of going to the moon with what it looks like to redesign high school, they were a bit prohibitive. And I was like, no, like we should be thinking about regulations that again incentivize not just the right things for students, but for schools, and being innovative and providing, you know, an education that will actually help kids do what they need to do. So I'm glad, in summary, I'm glad to see this virtual, I'm glad to see this virtual regulated. I want us to be honest about what virtual learning is, who it serves, and some of the challenges that are there, and not just apply like our experiences with COVID to that, because it existed before and it will exist after. And I think 80-20, the garbage needs to go, and I'm glad that we are shifting to 64.
Can we have a dialogue then? So like, could we then focus then on maybe like a course, like where you're incentivizing courses because students are picking which want to go?
We should have a dialogue. One thing we did not let Austin cover is what the next steps are.
Yeah.
Because this is not our own conversation with Austin.
Yeah. So I want to get Representative Wattenberg. I want to ask my questions, and I do want to move this on because we have one more big substantive piece of work tonight. And I don't want us to be here until 9 o'clock. So Representative Wattenberg.
So I want to second a lot of things that I heard about the problems with 60/40, so that you have heard it from more people, because I hear it all the time, exactly these
Problems with 60/40 or 80/20?
I mean, with the 80/20, sorry. But I want to go, for change of pace, go to the page with the example of the 60/40 in action. So I'm trying to line up and sync kind of how this works. And there's attendance in a course, there's attendance for a day, there's sort of attendance for safety, and there's attendance for incentives. I mean, there's so many things going on. So in this example, so this student is absent for two modules out of 2, 4, 5. So I guess he's there 60/40. Okay, but then it says down here, he's counted as present partial. So is that
So there's
good, better?
there's a codes that schools have to put in. So there's present full, present partial, absent partial, absent full. And so for you, and so from a system level, for you to be present full would mean that you were there 100% of the day. And so the present partial would be the 99 to 60%.
And if I'm there 60, right, so now we've moved from 80-20 to 40-60.
This is hard.
Yeah, it's essentially a tardy.
So I'm getting a tardy, in the sense that I'm counted as tardy, so going back to the earlier thing, the accountability, I'm counted as a tardy, not a truant, okay?
Yeah.
In terms of safety, if I'm always tardy, when does the school have to say something to somebody? In other words, if I'm always only coming in 40% of the day, when 60% of the day, sorry, I'm not good at numbers. 60% of the days, does the school ever have to call the parents? Does anybody ever have to call social services? What that,
Engagement.
Representative Thompson, I think you want
I
to
guess
go.
my question is safety for who? Because like with a Relisha Rudd, she was missing. Like nobody put their eyes on this little girl at all. She was missing. And like I really worry about, like, yes, we should be encouraging schools to say, hey, Emily Rose is late every day. T. Thompson, you a teacher, get it together. Why is your child late every day? But a referral to CFSA, like I want CFSA to be looking for Relisha.
no, I agree, I'm just trying to clarify.
I don't want CFSA to show up at my mama's house. Like, like I do. So I guess when I say safety for whom, because the other reason I think that the other thought that triggers for me is we moved to 80-20 after that South Capitol mess. Yes. Right. It really was in response to violence in neighborhood. And it gets really tricky when we talk about like who we're keeping safe from whom. And so is it safety for the kid? Like we're assuming something is happening in the household, or is it something else? Because that's when we involve CFSA. But I want CFSA focused on Relisha.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm just clarifying. So in other words, the 60-40, it's how it gets reported and it affects it's how it's reported for accountability. It's also affects whether or not there's any other reporting.
Yes.
The parents
Yes.
or somebody else. Okay.
Representative
And so this thing called partial attendance or partial present.
So just I want to make sure we get this fully right. Is referrals to CFSA are for full day unexcused absences. Like I don't see you at all.
Right.
Nobody
No,
gives
okay.
me a yes.
Okay.
So 16, 80, that doesn't affect that.
But so what does a present partial mean? I mean, what is the effect of that?
Yeah. So we collect one daily value for attendance a day at Aussie. That is where we are as an organization. That's the server capacity. That's the systems that we have built. Hopefully one day maybe we'll have more things. But what we do have is additional detail, right? So every year we put out codes. Like we put out a long Excel document of codes for schools to go and set up their student information systems and make sure that they're sending data the right way to us, right? We do all that. We do that at the start of each school year. Present partial is one of the codes. So we have some detail.
Okay.
That we,
So
we
in
can have
short,
some
let me
detail.
think. So present partial counts as a present.
Correct.
Yes.
In terms of,
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
But if somebody wanted to find out, they could find out. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
I think that's probably all I will ask at this point.
Okay, then I have one question for you. So my question, and I thank you for all the detail here, because this is very helpful, and I concur with Representative Thompson that having the regulation on the virtual environment is really important, especially as the window opens for more LEAs to seek that approval. Virtual schooling has gotten a bad rap, especially in the charter sector, for a very long time, It would be great not to slide down that mountain and to have some guardrails. So appreciate that. My question is about the timing of the next steps and how that impacts a school coming to you to look at their schedule for next year.
Yep.
So I'm sitting in a school leader's position and I'm looking at this calendar going, so Aussie is going to seek the state board approval in July, but I'm an LEA that starts PD in August. So how am I getting my new schedule approved if the regulations are not yet promulgated?
So instructional day is already, we're not touching the instructional day requirement as it sits now is the superintendent may weigh
Sure. Yep, got that.
180 instructional, 100 days, 6 hours per day with the breaks. We're not going to touch that. So we're going to issue our guidance like we do every year about, hey, you got to build your calendars. Remember, here's what the reg is. Remember, you have these flexibilities to do that. We wanted to make sure that everybody knew that because there's some new aspects that we're giving people some flexibility to do due to our circumstances. So we will go ahead and get that out. Schools will send those calendars. They do those calendars, right? Like we'll start doing that soon. We will approve that they will go on their way because they also can't turn on their data systems for the next school year.
That's right.
Some of that foundational stuff.
That's right.
So we're going to get that underway. With our attendance stuff, though, we are sharing with our LEA the same concepts that we have to give them a little bit to anticipate. We've got a lot of questions about 80-26 because there's some technical shifts that they've got to be able to do. And I think from this conversation, I think people are like, Justin, let them go ahead and do the things, which is good. But we will give them, once we have the approval to this process, we'll put out additional guidance about how we operationalize all of these things in the attendance regulator. We'll put out the reg, we'll put out our guidance documents. We usually use some FAQs to explain those things. We will move all of that later in the summer when we go through this process.
Okay, so if I'm sitting in a school leader's seat right now and I'm looking at this and I'm looking at the intention to shift it to 60-40, and I want to start building a different kind of schedule that would not have worked for me under 80-20, I should feel confident in the fact that the intention of Aussie is that if I build a new schedule, I'm looking at a 60-40 attendance approach for my students.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Unless you all don't yet.
You guys.
I mean, I certainly want
in the
to
right direction.
leave space for folks who are not present in this room, but the overwhelming urge from the folks sitting in this room right now has been 80-20's got to go.
Yeah.
So
To be candid, we have gotten, we have filled with those questions a little bit. And, I just told them like what happened in the council, right? It's like, we feel quite strongly we are going to do it. That's if we're talking to the state board. And I think having this conversation tonight makes sense.
One other question. Sorry. I mean, also, none of this precludes, schools have courses have their own requirements. That's separate.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct.
great. Then thank you for,
We'll be back in June. We'll have the words on the page. We'll do a little bit more discussion. And then we'll come back in July with the resolution and the approval at your July meeting. And we will go, we're going to do this as an emergency and proposed rule. So we've done this, so there might be some people before that we can do an emergency rule for, I think, 120 days. We'll use that to get the rule started, but then we'll go through administrative procedure and do proposed and final rulemaking, which also is an initial round of public comment. And then when it's a final rule, we publish it, it goes into the.
got it. Okay. Thank you for being here tonight. Very nice to meet you, gentlemen. Looking forward to working with you. We appreciate your dedication. All right, colleagues, we are turning now to our work plans and budget. Since we started this process in March, I am confident that representatives have reviewed the work plans. So I'm hoping that tonight we can dedicate our attention to informally agreeing on a priority list for budget requests, similar to what the board did last year under former President Parker. So we are trying as much as we can to iterate on that process because it seemed to work well last year. So before we get into the budget requests, and you have a packet in your materials that looks like this, it's the landscape with the table. Are there any questions from members about any committee work plans prior to shifting to budget requests?
I don't have, I do have it.
Okay, then we are going to dive right in on budget requests. So based on the committee request for funding and some additional new funding requests, which are not part of any committee work plans, but have been requested by members. And so I'll use as an example, you'll see it in the packet. The Student Advisory Committee mentioned in our last working session a need for some advocacy materials like t-shirts and buttons for their vaccination work. That's not specific to any of the committees that put in work plans because the Student Advisory Committee works a little differently, but we wanted to put it into the budget. Same thing for questions about conference attendance and a request that I'm going to let Mr. Hayworth talk a little more about having to do with National History Day. So I'm going to walk through the recommendations briefly, and then I'll open the floor for discussion. So what you start out with here is a table of the budget requests from each of the committees. I pulled this right out of the work plan sections on budgets, the SharePoint document that we all have had access to, and I just put it in this table. The first recommendation I want to make to colleagues is that based on the project descriptions and rationale for costs on most of the projects proposed, I want to recommend that we prioritize and fully fund the projects that are listed here under number 1 bullets. So translation summary of the comprehensive literacy plan, teacher and principal turnover report, board governance, and the communications and advocacy piece from the board governance committee as well, and then the literacy research project. The projects collectively cost $20,600. They're well within the budget that we have to spend. And since all of these require contracting or procurement, we want to get them going. So that's the first recommendation. Second is that there are a couple of requests that committees made where the costs are widely divergent, but the work is really similar. So these are 2 different engagement sessions. One is from Education Standards for 3 citywide engagements, 1 each on each of the topics under their work, and then accountability and assessment. But they're so very different. So right now, if you look on the table at Education Standards, they're estimating roughly $1,500 in total for those 3 sessions. And accountability and assessment is assessing the cost to be $4,600. So I'd love for those 2 committees to maybe talk through this with staff and clarify the total cost of funding so that we're not setting a precedent that says some engagements are going to cost very little and others are going to cost more, but rather we settle on like a multiplier factor. What does it cost to do a citywide engagement in a state board style? Maybe we'll use the ones that we did at the MLK Library and the Rec Center as our baselines. I asked Mr. Hayworth to take a look at those costs, and those are roughly $2,000 to $3,000 a piece to have the catering, to have access to the public space and pay any sort of reservation fee for that space, have materials translated and printed. It's roughly $2,000 to $3,000 per engagement. I think we should still plan to fund these engagements. I think we just need to get set on costs before we do that. And there is also money in the budget to do that, so long as the combined cost of the 2 engagements stay below $10,000 or stay at $10,000 or below. The third recommendation is clarify the project before deciding about funding. And so this is from Advocacy and Outreach, Dr. Reed. The family engagement piece is real clear that that money is for food, but there's not so much clarity on what the event or events are.
Yeah.
And so we'd love to just know more about that and then talk about it at the June working session.
And I feel like we can go all the way down. So, yeah, $2,000.
Okay, great. So if it comes up again, we can talk about it at the June working session. I still think that there's going to be money in the budget to fund it. So it's not a question of, we got to eliminate that. But we want to talk more about what it looks like to make sure that we understand. So those are the top 3 recommendations, which basically says like, we can probably fund all this work, which is super exciting. But we just want to get clear on some numbers. The new and non-committee requests are here. The student advisory committees, advocacy funding at roughly $8,000 for t-shirts, buttons, other promotional materials for the vaccination promotion work. I'm going to turn to Mr. Hayworth to talk about NASB and the National History Day, and then we can talk about those. But I just want to preview number 5. These are costs that committees said, we think this is right for FY23. So we've put them in here, and I'm going to propose that we talk about this at our August working session, because by then we will know what our budget for next year is. The council will have voted, we'll have a final budget, and we can start to discuss how we allocate money for these kinds of projects. before I turn to Mr. Hayworth to talk about these budget items, are there any questions about these recommendations?
I have a question. So I had sent an email to people and have raised at various meetings, the idea of coming together across to do a survey. So is that precluded by these? Should I add this into this discussion? Should I raise it in new business? I'm not sure how you're.
Yeah, so the reason it's not in here is we don't have a value for it. And I don't know what it would cost or whether it would sit with a particular committee, because it's never, you have raised it, but it has never come through any of the committee processes,
Right, 'cause it's
nor have we
meant to
gotten a
go-
value.
Right, so it's meant to go across committees and John Paul could give it a value because we've done it before. So I'll just say that, and I'll back off. I can raise it under new business if you want, doesn't matter.
I mean,
Let me ask colleagues, what do you think of this idea that Representative Wattenberg sent the survey about earlier today?
Let me just say, the idea would be that different committees, so that you'd have sort of a scientific survey, because one of the issues that we've had in the past is, is it scientific, what does it represent? And we've done one where we had a professional pollster who was able to, poll essentially a scientific sample. I mean, it's a certain kind, but anyway. And then we could ask questions across different issues. And what's nice about a survey, first of all, we are meant, one of the things we say about ourselves, we are the voice, we are the independent voice in the city, and it gives us some ability to say that with some data behind us. And also, frankly, it's very PR worthy. Surveys get attention and they can have an effect on how people think of things. So it's a way to do that. And the last thing I'll say is, so I did one which I sent out to people, and as I was doing it, as I say in the memo, a lot of it ends up being about literacy. And I talked to Alistair about it. He couldn't be here today, and he was very supportive. Now, we did not talk about should it come out of that committee or whatever, but anyway, I just wanted to say that.
So I don't know how this works. So I made the assumption that, like, when I read this document, there is a place for new and non-committee requests. I'm also going to be honest and say, yes, I saw an email today, but I was working. So I have never.
I am in the same boat because it only came in a couple hours before the meeting.
So I don't feel, I'm happy to start the conversation there. And I think that's the place based on the way this is laid out. So I'm also just gonna be fully transparent and say, no, I have not read this yet. I am at least familiar with Representative Wattenberg bringing it up at the last meeting. But that's where I think it fits structurally.
I think we should hold off on the discussion after everybody reads it, because I didn't even know I got it.
Okay, that's fine. I've been trying to get on the agenda, and I guess I failed, obviously, but that's what I've been trying to do, so now it's up.
Dr. Reed, do you want to add something? And then I'll turn to Mr. Hayward.
Yes, I have a question for number one, for the communications and advocacy. I know you mentioned that those are things that are going to be subtracted. Could you refresh me on what that item is about?
It's under the board governance. So if you come down the table, it's the second board governance, communications and advocacy. Funds for this budget item will go towards printing out and translating an 8 to 10 page booklet, providing information and recommendations for governance in the district.
Gotcha.
And as I understand it, it would come following the survey.
So it comes later. It actually would be delivered in 23, but the contracting has to happen earlier. So it needs to be in the budget, is that correct? That's what we
some of that, yes. So we do not have the authority to contract over fiscal years. We can't do multi-year contracts. So the deliverable would have to be done by September 30 in order to be using FY22 funding. So if it's something that we want a deliverable in, say, November, we would need to use FY23 funds for that. But it really depends on the timelining of exactly how it works.
What I actually suspect is that, so that was my first suspicion, but my other suspicion is that our communications and advocacy request somehow got switched with our engagement request. I think those two were switched in the timeline.
So the board governance 2022 citywide engagement should replace.
I think so.
Okay.
because that actually what happened. It was one of those things that failed starting in September.
Got it.
And so when Darren and I talked, two things were possible. I said, if necessary, we could move that to 23.
Mhm.
But the booklet wouldn't be based on our work plan. That wouldn't be delivered until, that would be solidly in 15 to 22, about like December, January. So I know that shouldn't be to 22 unless there was some reason to the contract, which there is not.
Okay, so it sounds like then, thank you for this good question, Representative Reed, because it is, here's where we land then. If you take a look at page 6, the last item, board governance 2022 community engagement citywide, the amount is $4,058. That is going to go into an FY22 chart, so this first chart, and will replace the communications and advocacy line, which has a line item of 5,400.
And I would say, in line with those conversations about what does it cost to do
Yes.
engagement, and we also made
We
an
anticipated where I'm
assumption-
going next.
Oh, yeah, okay. I was like, we also made an assumption that there might be opportunities to do across committee.
Yeah. Totally. So what I'm gonna then say is that this number one recommendation, thanks for following along with budget numbers here. The projects listed there collectively now drop down to $15,200. We add the governance engagement to number 2, clarify cost before funding. And then governance, accountability and assessment, education standards, all figure out what it costs to engage and decide, do we hold lots of different sessions? Do we hold multi-purpose sessions like we did at the MLK Library and the Rec Center? And then the advocacy and communications piece for the board governance goes into the FY23 budget to be discussed in August. Everyone follow that okay with me? Okay, we'll make the updates on the sheet. It does not change the substance of, we can fund everything in number 1. We can fund everything in number 2. We can fund number 3 if we decide that the family engagement having money makes sense, we can do that. And now we're going to talk about number 4, which are things it is not clear that we can fund all of in FY22. So Mr. Hayworth, if we were to say to spend all the money for 1, number 2 now roughly comes up to 14,000. Okay, so 15,000, 14,000, or 30,000 roughly. If we fund $32,000 of items in 1 to 3, what does that leave us with?
That's a hard question.
Okay.
Because we're still working on exactly how much will be available. We found some savings in previous POs. So we were able to find it around $8,000 to $10,000 for sure that we can spend.
Okay.
In contracts and those types of things. We also have additional leeway using our P card, our purchase card, because of how much we obligated at the beginning of the fiscal year. We probably have between $10,000 and $15,000 there that we could use via the P card or de-obligate and use in contracts.
Okay.
And so I would say we probably have it in the range of 15 to 30 additional thousand in FY22 that I would say I'm 70% confident that we can use.
Okay.
I am 95% confident that we have at least $10,000 to $15,000.
Okay. So what I'd love to do then is ask you to talk about the 2 items that are here, as well as if you could give some insights, especially for our new members, as to what prior scientific surveys have cost the board. For instance, when we did the work on teacher, I'm not gonna remember the specific title of it. Yeah, the teacher turnover retention report.
Sure.
Great.
Sorry.
I think we're all, I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're all clear on the student funding that's for materials, and that could be either P card purchases or other budget funds, right?
Sure.
Okay, cool.
So each year we talked about this a couple of times. The NASB annual conference happens in October. That's a really challenging time fiscally for us because the P card doesn't always activate immediately, and we can't do contracting until the day of October 1st. So what we do regularly, and this But because of that change in the fiscal year, because of the differences in cost between that purchasing of flights and hotels ahead of time, we typically book the annual conference attendees in the summer when registration starts for that conference. And so the conference this year is going to be in Phoenix, and it is October 26th through the 28th. And what I'm estimating here is if we have 8 people who want to go to that conference, it will likely cost us around $24,000 in terms of registrations, which are around, well, depends, so I don't want to say that specifically. But hotels for 3 nights, flights for us to get out to Phoenix, and that type of thing. I'm estimating somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 per person who wants to go. I sit on the NASB board, and so my flights, hotel, and registration are covered by NASB for most of the trip, so I get to go just because. But there are also opportunities for staff who would want to go as well. For instance, she's watching, so hi, Malayo. I have proposed actually Malayo to be a panel speaker related to the communications work that she does with us at the conference, and that has been received fairly well so far from the panel, the conference planning committee, and so I'm assuming that she will go as a panelist. I'm currently sitting on the conference planning committee, so that kind of helps somewhat. But I mean, it's one of the things that we need to consider is how much are we going to have available for those types of things? Do we need to have a limitation then on how many individuals get to go to the annual conference? I think that would be challenging for all of us to have to say, oh, well, you get to go and you don't get to go, because it's a great conference for everyone to be able to go to. So I just want to note that is an expenditure that we usually do sometime in July and August in order to save some money on flights and hotels and those types of things. The last one that is on here, of course you can.
I'm assuming when you say Malayo could be a panel, who pays for Malayo?
Don't know. It depends. Usually there would be some sort of stipend, or that they may cover like a day in the hotel or something like that.
But they will wait for
Or they may waive the registration fee or something like that. So it may be lower for panelists and those types of things as well. I am also, yes, so that's a really good question.
Okay.
Yeah. Other questions related to NASB? Sorry, I should have asked that. Yes.
Can I ask that if there is like something that we say only X amount of people go, that number includes that any one of the 4 student representatives has the option to go? So like if we say only 8 people can go, one of those is a student, would that be possible?
I think that is a question for the board. I think it is a wonderful suggestion, but I am not for the board.
But you're already a superstar.
I mean, obviously I would love it to be all 4, but like if we
Yeah.
had a limitation, could we say that?
Sure.
So having
Make sure
not
that-
been to a NASB conference, are there strands for student members?
There are. There
Then
are
I
numerous
think this
grants,
is a
not
reason.
only just for student members, but student members are often panelists as well. So it may be that we might be able to think about it that way. That is an option.
And I know at the legislative convention, this might be a little different because I was a panelist, but I asked for a fee waiver so that I could take someone with me, and they gave me that easily. Maybe that was only because I was a panelist, or maybe it was also because that person was also a student.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that we could certainly ask. We do need to remember as well that this is a conference for NASB that does need to raise money for the organization. So I don't think we could ask for a ton of them.
Not
But I
4.
think we absolutely can certainly ask as well. And some of the liability issues with bringing student representatives, we
Sure.
also need to talk through and how that works. But I think it's a solid point in it. It also makes a lot of sense given the board's commitment to student voice.
Yeah.
That
I suppose it also depends if the person goes as 18 or not.
correct.
Given the request, what I'd love to say is that as we decide how to allocate money for the NASB conference, we also add to a board level discussion. And I don't know whether details about the conference are like registration hasn't opened yet, right?
No,
Okay, so that before we make any decisions about this, that we also have this conversation at a full board level. I will say, and noting that Representative Parker and Representative Gassoy and Representative Chang are not here, and I'd want to make sure that we get to have the conversation with the full board, but please consider the request made. And we will add it to future discussion for the board to have, because I think it's a really important and valuable request.
any other questions related to NASB before I move to National History Day?
Can we pay for our own food?
It depends. It's a very good question. And let me actually go ahead and address that. Here.
The question was about food at the conference.
Yeah, there is generally, you can either get per diem or reimbursement. You can't get both. And so if we do the per diem, it does not cover any days where conference would provide you food. Generally, the conference provides breakfast and lunch. So you might get a dinner if there's not a dinner accompanying the conference. But yes, that is an option. The alternative, like I said, is reimbursement, which can take a little bit longer, but we can't do that as well. But that has not been factored into this, which is a really good point. So I will do that before our next meeting.
Wait, I have one quick question.
Yeah.
So for the NASB annual conference, that's all in person? There's no way that this is like,
As of right now, it is fully in person. If that changes, we will have a different conversation.
We just saved $20,000.
Yeah.
Representative Wattenberg, do you have a question?
No, I was gossiping about that. And I mean, it was about, we have, nobody's figured out how to have a good virtual, hybrid conference. Just how that would be a good thing. Wasn't anything,
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this goes to even to our previous conversation
Yeah,
about how we
exactly.
do our
It's just-
public meetings too, right?
yeah.
It's really complicated and
Yeah.
costs a lot of money as well. Okay, so NASB, I'm gonna put that aside. If anyone does have any questions, certainly feel free to let me know. The next part is National History Day. I'm not sure how familiar all of you are with National History Day program. I have been a judge for at least 6 years of the National History Day program here in DC. It has been hosted for the past 16 years at the National Archives. It's a year-long academic program that fits in with curriculum and with education standards. There's over 500,000 middle school and high school students across the world that participate in doing this programming, doing original research on their historical topics of interest that relate to the overall theme that is set by the National History Day organization. Students then, through their research, their original research and projects, they enter the projects in a contest at the local affiliate levels. For us, that's just the state level because we don't have multiple things. But for instance, in Maryland, they would do it at their school level, then potentially the district level, then at the state level, and then to the national competition, which is held every year at the University of Maryland, College Park. So the National Archives, just down the street, you can literally almost wave to it from here, has been a host for 16 years, and they have decided to cease being the host. And that will end in August. Their partnership with the organization will end in August. We can talk offline about that. So the national program is looking for new sponsors for the program for the 22-23 school year specifically, so next school year, but also longer term. How do we make sure that this program continues to exist and expands, and so that additional students in the district have access to it? The district is a little bit different than other states. Other states' affiliate organizations charge students to participate in the program, charge teachers for the materials, those types of things, because there is a cost associated with that. The district in the National Archives has been covering that cost for the past 16 years. And the whole cost for the program in DC right now is around $20,000 per year. There is a smaller fee, which is the affiliate fee. So that's making sure that the program exists for next year, which is around $2,600 for next year. And that would be due in August-ish, July, August. So I have had a number of conversations with some organizations in DC, including the Public Library System, the DC History Center. I've reached out to the Commission of Arts and Humanities and the Humanities Council, and trying to find, gauge interest. Is there a group out there that is willing to take this responsibility on for not only the logistics of the National History Day competition, but also making sure that the engagement piece happens, which is the reaching out to schools and teachers and getting them interested in the program and understand how it works and how to do the research. And I've had some really strong conversations with folks about how this program could exist, absent now the leadership of the National Archives. So like I said, eventually there is a need for a probably lead partner, a lead affiliate, and then some other organizations that they would work with. DC Public Libraries has already stepped forward and agreed that they will host the competition next year. They have agreed to do that not only at the MLK Library, but in local branches as well, and have agreed to also help identify through their local librarians assistance for students who are doing this original research so that they have access to those items at their local library, and will partner then also with school librarians to expand this type of program. So that's really exciting. However, there still needs to be a lead. And I'm proposing to the board that the state board step into that role for next year. Not necessarily that we do it forever, but for the next year, the state board serve as this sort of lead affiliate organization of this group to make sure that the information about the program gets out to students and teachers, and helps to serve as the sort of overall lead for the competition it's usually in March or April of next year. I believe this is possible only because, as we mentioned earlier, the council has provided us with an additional staff person for education standards. And I feel like there's going to be that additional capacity coming out in October, that we could do this for a short period of time without it being a huge burden on the rest of the staff or on board members. But I do think it's a pretty large commitment for the board to be taking on something like this. This is new. So this is why I'm proposing it now, because the affiliate fee, which is the smaller cost of $2,600, is the fee that would be needed to be paid by probably the end of August or early September.
I'm going to add one piece of color commentary. Mr. Hayworth brought this already to Vice President Thompson and I. I've also been a judge for National History Day for the past 2 years and was a school level judge for a few years at Capital City. Actually, Representative Bernstein's not here, but Dr. Andrew Sick at Capital City runs the competition there, and I was a judge there before as well. I think it has an interesting intersection with the social studies standards coming out and the role the board has played in that. I also think it's an opportunity to help keep partnering with other organizations, other like agencies and entities in the district. But putting it out for this discussion, just wanted to make sure that colleagues knew that Vice President Thompson and I have already heard this idea from Mr. Hayward. Questions?
You're one of our pickers.
Then first.
Oh, really?
I like that. I like that. Table's turn.
I'm all for it, but I really am, just to piggyback on the standards, Aussie doesn't even have a social studies person, right? Which is a crime. And I don't want to let our government, even though we're part of the government, I don't think that we should be doing something that the mayor should be doing, or that, well, really, that the mayor should be doing. So I guess that I don't know how to say this, because I'm all for it, all right? But I think that we need to partner with the mayor and the our education partners. And I don't think we should be paying 1 cent. Does that make sense? I mean, you know, when you were talking about that, I can find a donor. We talked about that before. I know somebody that would donate $2,600. All right, that's not the problem. The problem is accountability. And this is something that the government should step up and be in charge of.
Do we know who plays the role of leads? I was just Googling, who plays the role of leads in other states?
It depends. In a number of states, it is their humanities councils, which are, you know, sort of those semi-governmental organizations. In some places, it is governmental agencies like the Department of Human Services or the Department of Education. Or
Humanities, we got a humanities council in DC.
We do, and it's a semi now an independent
Right.
agency, right? So it's not part of the mayor's office anymore. So that's an interesting thing. But yes, that's why one of the organizations that I reached out here. And in other organizations, they are nonprofit organizations, either ones with good connections through the education sphere, or that are dealing with civic education, or whatever it is.
Okay.
Actually, what I wanted to say was actually very similar to what Representative O'Leary said. First, if it weren't for the fact that we're getting that additional staff person, I'd say, oh my God, no, we can't do it. We do have that staff person, and I would say, insofar as there's a part of the work that helps the state board reach out, make contacts, develop networks, I think that's fine, very limited. But and the reason is really what Representative O'Leary is saying. We're not a philanthropy. We are an underfunded agency that doesn't have the money to do the things that we should be doing. And I think it really sends the wrong message to say we can pick up these tabs. And so it's I've also been a judge, and it's a great organization. I want to help it, and I want to, you know, support it in whatever ways are sort of kind of organic to us. And I also think, you know, one thing John Paul and I have gone back and forth on a lot, we need to be engaged. We should have bigger mailing lists. We should have people we can write to, and all of this can be very symbiotic, whatever the right word is, synchronistic. So in that sense, I'm for it, but I'm not for us seeing this as, you know, we have these extra resources and this is a needy group and we can help them because we're a needy group too. And we can help them get some money. We can help them where it works for both sides.
Vice President Thompson.
So I have a couple different thoughts. So one is, my questions were about capacity. I can speak louder too. My questions were largely about capacity. I am consistent in acknowledging our truth that we have a small but mighty team. I also, and I do think that we will have some added capacity temporarily. I think it's important that if we are making this commitment, we are very clear that it is a stopgap. I don't think we should own this like forever. Like this is somebody's going to pay the $2,600 in August. We need to still leverage a whole bunch of dollars from other agencies.
Yes.
And so it would, as I understand it, it will be a coordination role for this year with the idea of finding it a permanent home to both of your points around like where we fit in and who else should and could do this. What I don't know is if, and I guess I should have asked, if it sounded like there were not the conversations for anyone else to take this on by August. Like it just would not happen at all. Is that correct? Is that
Yes.
correct?
And part of yes, that is true. And part of it for the government resources side is the FY22 budget is done, right? We're already in FY22. The FY23 budget is already done generally in the council. So any government agency asking for additional funding right now it's not going to happen, right? So another government agency might be able to shift some funds around for next year for the additional funds, which is that full 20,000 that I was talking about. But unless they have a foundation, or unless they have some some private philanthropy to pay for it, it would be really challenging. And I think that's what the point that Dr. Leary is trying to make, is that there are philanthropists out there who might be willing to step up and do that type of thing. But unless there's someone coordinating that work, then it's also not going to happen. But I think these points are all exactly what I've been thinking too.
Yeah, so my 2 cents would be, and I think one of the reasons that we're having this conversation now is because it was brought to us. It was time sensitive, and we were like, we should talk to the board around this, right? Like, so my 2 cents would be, I am comfortable if we can make it make sense within our other priorities for saying we will make sure this happens this year. I would not be comfortable with getting into and we're going to pay for this every year, and we're going to have the capacity of it. Like, I think that's unacceptable. I also just don't think that's sustainable, right? I don't think that's the world we want to play. I do think that if it makes sense and it can fit within the budget, then we could and should do it. If it doesn't make sense and it doesn't fit within the budget, then I guess that's our answer. But one of the things that at least I was like, do we have the capacity to do this? If we didn't have the capacity for this particular window, then I would have been like, yeah, that, it would be sad, but it's not real, right? Like, I'm allergic to magical thinking. So that's where things line up for me. But I also think it's in context with the larger budget discussion.
Yeah, I'm not for pay. I mean, I think we can take on some of the work, given that we have the extra staff person. I think paying for it really, it's wrong.
Do you have a suggestion on where we might steer folks then, knowing that there are other agencies that Mr. Harewood has talked to that do not feel like they can sustain this year?
I don't know. I like phrases philanthropist, whoever that is.
Oh, I'm not talking about the money part. I'm talking about the accountability part. I'm talking about the governmental.
As I-
Let me ask, I think that's something honestly to lean on to make sure it doesn't happen. Like, I really think that, like, I would not have a problem with saying, like, we stepped up all the things that you said around, like, this should have never even been a situation in the first place. This needs a permanent home.
Yeah.
That being actually an actual lobbying point, that it has a permanent home and it has permanent funding moving forward.
Yeah.
I agree with all of that. I think the question for us is this something that we even want to, like, this year? Are we gonna bite the bullet or not? And
When do we need to know?
I have 2 questions that go along with this question. One is, when is the final deadline to pay? And 2 is, could we play the coordinating role, to Representative Wattenberg's point, if we are not the fiscal agent? Or is the lead also the fiscal agent?
The affiliate is generally the fiscal agent.
So I think it's a both and. Like, I think we pay and we're the affiliate, or someone else pays and they're the affiliate. I don't think there's an option for us to be the affiliate with someone else paying. I could, that is.
I mean, I think there would be the donations piece is challenging as well for us as a government entity, so it would be challenging. But I mean, I'm happy to work out whatever is worked out. The affiliate fee identifies the sort of main person who would do contact with a national organization. So other organizations, so like, let's say, I don't know, the Widget Incorporated decided to become the affiliate. We could still partner with them, to Representative Wattenberg's point, and do some of that engagement work and use our resources to expand and do, have those conversations directly with teachers and families and all those type of thing. And I think we should, regardless of who is the affiliate. But it is just a matter of trying to identify the specifics of the affiliate for this next year is what we're talking about.
And we have to do that by date certain.
I'm not sure. I know the current MOU with the National Archives expires on August 1st.
Okay.
So if there's not an affiliate by that point, and again, it is a year-long program.
Right.
So someone needs to sort of step up and be that person by the start of school.
Yeah.
Or students would be behind and not really be able to sit in program.
So here's what I'm gonna propose. The evening is getting late. I want to wrap up our budget
That's
discussion
already unproposable.
and give Representative Wattenberg a moment to talk about this survey once you give us a number. So I'd like to add this to the items we'll clarify the projects before deciding about funding and talk about it at the June working session. So we'll add that to the number 3 here.
A good question. I didn't know anything about technology. I know you mentioned it, it's going to mention technology for our session. Is that, I didn't see that. Is that in there?
So tonight we borrowed the owl. I think we have to decide how we feel about the owl and whether it worked. I've gotten a couple of texts that seem to say it worked better, which is good. You're right, that would go under another non-committee funding request.
That's great.
Thank you for bringing that up. Mr. Hayworth, before I turn back to Representative Wattenberg, can you just give us a sense of how much, and thank you first for explaining and answering all those good questions. It's how much the teacher retention survey we did with a scientific research institution cost us.
I am honestly logging in to refresh my memory to the
Okay,
contracting service. So give me 1 second.
no problem.
I don't want to miss the.
Nope. For that owl technology piece, I think we talked about that, that's roughly a $1,500 to $2,000 cost.
For that piece of equipment right there, yeah.
Yeah, for this little job we do.
But it seems to working really well, from what I understand. I mean, as long as we have, place it appropriately and those types of things. The video for those who are in the room and haven't seen these owls before. So the thing on top is a 360-degree camera, and so when you speak, it zooms in on you as the speaker, and so there are separate windows. There are separate windows.
Oh, wow.
That each
There we are.
up to 3 the windows where individual speakers can see. So it's really an interesting way of presenting the information. And the speaker sounds pretty good, I think. I mean, when our representatives were speaking, they were on the Zoom, you could hear them clearly, they can hear us clearly, and that translates over to the YouTube as well. So it's
Great.
really great.
I'd say it was seamless in terms of like when you called on a person, they knew you were calling on and were able to engage, which is great. Yeah, super exciting. Yay, technology that works. So we're gonna wait for this number. Representative Wattenberg, besides the number, anything else you want to say in terms of like timing? I will say, you're right, the survey list that you presented earlier today is literacy heavy. Then there were some COVID questions. I'll note that in the other projects that committees requested, there is only one other survey. So I don't know whether we would seek to incorporate that or keep that separate. It feels important for board governance to be separate because of the timing.
Oh, this survey is gonna happen soon, yes.
Yeah. So do you have a sense of like, I know you've talked about wanting this to be an annual effort.
Yeah, here's the only other thing I would say is, right, I think it could be an annual effort, and I think that we should think of what are the things that, I mean, part of it comes up in the governance, there's so many things we don't know, right? I mean, how many schools, I mean, this isn't a good one because the council has not done it, but how many schools have COVID coordinators, or how many schools have whatever? This is a way to sort of do our own research. And one thing I was thinking of, and I don't want to say this because I want to talk to the standards committee, but actually it overlaps a lot with what the standards committee proposed for its research project. And so actually a question with that is what's the better way to get information on our teachers? Is it right? So maybe it actually is interchangeable with that. That's a possibility. I don't want to say it, and I'm not sure about that. But what I really hope to do, and I am sorry that I didn't get the email out early, was to get people to just sort of brainstorm a little bit. Like if you could find out what % of the teachers in the city thought X or had X, what would you want to ask? Alternatively, we can do it for parents, and it could still be about literacy. I mean, one of the questions for parents is, have you ever, how long, have you ever had an issue trying to get your child evaluated for a reading disability or for any disability? How long did it take? That would be a really useful piece of information for us to have as we go to budget years, as we try to represent people around the city. So it's really to sort of think about what are the kinds of things that we want to be able to say publicly that it would be useful to have some backup for. And every year there's things like that. And if we sit down and we all sort of brainstorm, and I think we can come up with things that are really worth knowing. And that's really what I was just trying to get after.
Sure. So the last time that we did the all teacher survey, the cost was $32,000 for that all teacher survey. And that one, if I remember correctly, that survey was delivered in 2 ways, right? We asked LEAs to send it out on our behalf to their teacher workforce. And then we also asked the teachers union to send it out to their membership as well. If I'm correct.
And so this was not something where we were sourcing the participants for the survey.
Correct.
Okay. My one concern, Representative Wattenberg, and I think I've said this previously, but
I'm sorry. I thought we were, so, I mean, we did get the list, did we not, for the, we did not at all, not for either sector, we just, okay, sorry.
is that is almost the entirety of all the committee project budgets, including the in-person engagement with our constituents. And that concerns me, that to do a survey like this with an outside firm would just eat up much of the committee work budget we have.
I thought we were going to talk about that at the next meeting.
Well, if this was, I think, where we proposed to do it was just here in the non-committee costs. So we don't have to decide anything. The number was just to come up here, but I am highlighting that.
And let me just say, I wouldn't want it to replace everything. So if that's what it is, that's the end of that. But I would want to throw out one other thing, which is something we had started and then came the pandemic and our own, some other things, is we've talked about, and I get maybe this would be cheaper, and you know, Mr. Hayworth may have some previous knowledge about this based on previous discussions, is to set up our own internal ability to do those things. In other words, that we have a way of drawing the names, that we have a way of, you know, checking the questions with a pollster, that these are fair questions, that we have, you know, that we somehow work with a pollster to set up an ongoing ability for the board to survey. And then we could do it periodically. We could do 4 questions about COVID when there's a COVID epidemic. We could do 5 questions about governance when we want to know about governance. And I know organizations that do that, so that's a possibility. That's another way to think about it.
I'm not familiar with any, I know we as an organization have not done any contracts like that where it would be, I believe the terms would be either fee for service or having someone on retainer. I don't know that we could do it on retainer. Fee for service, we might be able to do, and we might be able to identify, I mean, and what I'm thinking through is one of the ways that the district does translation services is through an indefinite duration, indefinite quantity contract. Usually those are large contracts, millions of dollars, and then they're issued out to a number of vendors under that specific thing. I don't know if we could do one for under a small amount, you know, for a smaller amount of money, but we might be able to. Usually IDIQs are also multi-year. So anyway, there's contracting things. So there's a potential that we could do something like that. That money would then go to that vendor, whether, I mean, not in fee for service, but if we did there's a guarantee to that person that we would use at least X amount of dollars.
Yep. And
it would be it, right? So we would have to obligate that money to that pollster for the year or for what it was. If we used it all, then we would be kind of, you know, done for the year. And if we didn't use it all, then we would have to pay it anyway. So I think that's possible. We've just never done it.
Yeah, so anyway, I propose that as, and let me start a couple of.
Well, so I want to let Vice President Thompson get her point in, and I want to note it's 8:20 and we still have to do committee reports.
Okay, yeah, so I'm gonna have to extend my parking, that's where we're at with this. I want some time to actually read what was sent. I will say, as I am listening, what would be worthwhile to me is if we entertain this as an annual expenditure for it to be something that built over time. So I don't know what the questions are that are proposed, but like I see value in things that are, this comes out every year. We can see if there was movement on this, right? Or we're tracking, like, what are the things, but I'm not so sure that I would be able to articulate if I thought about like, what are the things across our work that will come up every year? Like, is it the same constituencies every year? Is it different ones? Are the places we would like to do? I have a feeling that if we wrestled with that a bit, there could be something valuable, but I think my default is, if it's this type of expenditure, I would want it to be something that built over time that informed a knowledge base kind of across our work, not just that it was like, all right, you know, the survey's coming out. You got 2 questions, you got 2 questions. Yeah. Because then it doesn't have, for me at least, the same like impact. You know, like it's not like when I think about, and I'm on fumes now. It's been a very long day. But like when I think about things like the moment and count for like homelessness, like that is a specific measurement that matters over time. Like it's a lot of work that goes into it, but like no, we agree that it matters. This number matters, and it's going to matter for a long time. It's going to inform our work. Or when I think about some of the report cards around like student, like I don't know, kids safety or disaster preparedness, like those are things that matter over time because you want to see policy shift towards creating better conditions. And so that's just kind of where I would want to go with something like this, but I also suspect that that's going to require a bit of wrestling and probably some iteration from the full.
So given that, and the points that Representative Wattenberg raised and the contracting things that we've never done before, but that might exist, I have a couple of suggestions. One, we add it back to the June working session, along with some of these other expenses, the technology piece, the National History Day conversation, the NASB annual conference to talk about in June. In the meantime, we learn as much as we can about if other contracting opportunities exist, if other agencies have done such a thing. The other thing we might think about is a way to ask for that in our need for appropriations for the FY24 budget, which we are about to start having conversations about. So these are also potential longer term.
We did, by the way, we did put it in the budgets for 2 or 3 years as a special research budget, but it's not continuous, so it's always an issue.
Got it. Well, it was the research budget though, which wasn't always this, right?
Correct, although it was pitched initially for the initial funder. It doesn't matter. Though.
Okay. Informally, because we're not voting on anything, are there any concerns about moving ahead with the items that the leadership recommended to fully fund?
No concerns, but I think the SAC's request can definitely be made cheaper.
Okay.
Like I think you can say no t-shirts, let's do stickers.
Okay.
Like I think that's one of the places where we have to talk to the other 2 student representatives who aren't here right now, but Juliana and I think that that's just an easier way to do it.
Okay.
Stickers are still visible.
I love a good sticker. I have them all over my laptop, which had I remembered it, you all would have seen.
It might not make the biggest dent, but it's a little.
Well, I will leave it then to the student advisory committee to follow up with Mr. Hayworth once you all
After our next
convene
meeting
your colleagues.
on Monday.
Great. But thank you for that. So are there any objections to moving ahead with the fully funding the projects listed in number 1? Then I'd like to ask the staff to go ahead and work with their committee chairs to get started on any steps that need to happen to start those processes. I'd also love to ask the staff to work with the committee chairs for governance, ed standards, and accountability and assessment to get some final numbers on engagement and figure out if there are ways to merge those opportunities so that we can also move ahead with funding those engagements and scheduling those engagements. Any objections or concerns there? Great, and then we'll talk more in June. I appreciate everyone sticking with me for that. I know there was a lot that we had to go on through, but hooray for all the work that y'all plan to do. And now we get to do. Yay. All right, we are on to committee reports. I'm gonna call each committee, invite them to give their report. I'm gonna put on a timer. We're gonna stick to 5 minutes. Let's see.
Can I make a suggestion?
Sure.
Could we submit our committee reports to everyone?
So we do have already submitted committee reports, which are up on Simply, but I still want to honor the fact that if committee chairs would like to make any sort of comment, they can. Okay,
So it's optional, not.
optional. Yep. So student advisory committee, anything to report?
Yes, yeah, it's a pretty short report. So in the month of April, we met twice. We met on the 11th and the 25th. In both meetings, we had Ms. Donna Johnson come over from Aussie and join us to share about and receive some feedback on the work Aussie is doing with both the school report card and the accountability framework. So for the year 2022 and 2023, on the 11th, President Sutter and Mr. Jew also joined us from the State Board of Education to present about the revisions made to the social studies standards. And then on the 25th, we met, we were joined by George Washington student, Ms. Druckerman, to share about an opportunity that will be taking place over the summer for students to do more activity work.
Cool.
And that's it.
All right. Thank you, students. Excellent. Almost a minute. Fantastic. Wonderful. Accountability and assessments.
I'm not in your report. I think that, oh, is
Josh
that
is
John?
here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got you guys. And I'll be quick and everything. I don't know if I can do it in a minute, but I'll do somewhere thereabouts. It won't be the full 5 minutes. But we met on the 21st, and unfortunately, I was not in that particular meeting, but everybody else on our committee was in that meeting. Some of the highlights basically are that the Assessment and Accountability Committee, our meeting members, we basically reflected on the ongoing feedback sessions, which we got a great report from Ms. Johnson today. We talked a little bit more about that. We also had a meeting. At that particular time, we were talking about the meeting that was coming up with Dr. Grant. Since then, we've had that meeting, myself and my co-chair. I believe the meeting went pretty well. We got an understanding of where we were headed, why the timeframes that Ms. Johnson reported out that she gave us to make sure that we did have that input as much as possible. We did have an outline kind of conversation of if there were things that we kind of didn't agree on, how would we reconcile those type of things. But we've heard some of the things tonight from Ms. Johnson about how they're looking at putting forth their amendment. So that was part of the discussion. Let me see, hold on one more. Let's see, I'm looking at my notes. We also worked on our work plan and the funding request, which we talked about this evening. And then just our next steps. Our next steps is that the chair will finalize the work plan, which we've done. Carlene is interested in discussing alternative assessments. And I just want to make sure, Dr. Carlene Reed, that I said that correctly, that you're working on alternative assessments for the May committee meeting. Is that correct?
Remember that, Doc?
That's what they have down in the notes. I'm just reading the notes specifically.
There was a general discussion about you want to look into alternatives to park over a period of time that everybody weighed in on it.
I may have mentioned, I remember that it was very.
So my notes are accurate. You just trying to recall everything that was discussed in the meeting. I get it. So I appreciate it. And then we're just talking about a research chart and memos we're working with Darren on. So a lot of good things are happening, but really we're really focused on what's coming out of the accountability with Ms. Johnson. That's our major focus and how we're going to respond to that, and making sure that in Fidelity, as much of what we put forth in our recommendations get adopted. So thanks. Anything else of any members since I wasn't there?
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Patterson. Admin.
So most of what we talked about in our admin committee, we experienced this evening. Ongoing budget discussion. We have followed up with the Mayor's Office of Racial Equity. You already know that they are going to be working with us. So that's awesome.
On our equity audit.
On our equity audit. So that is great, which also is one of the reasons you did not see it in the budget. We don't have to pay for it. We can work with them for free. We talked to, you also got an invite for a retreat in October that came out of our admin committee conversation. Accept the invite. Let us know if there are things, and we'll have some conversations about what that, what what that looks like and if there are recommendations. Most of the other stuff is pretty boring. Budget combo. We have to do better with the tech. We hopefully are doing better with the tech. Yeah, so pretty straightforward. What's that? I can do double or nothing.
What, double or nothing, board governance?
All right, double or nothing, board governance. So we actually had a presentation from Dan Davis. He joined us to talk about some of the things that in his role as a student advocate have come up over time around like governance, like challenges, pain points, just feedback he's gotten, any recommendations. He talked a little bit about comparisons between different cities. I will say the full notes are linked to our committee report if people want to dive into that. He also talked about, we also had some recommendations around just some of the frustrations that continue to come up, some things around school miscommunication, frustration with actually attendance policies during the pandemic was heard from families, things around facilities, and then just challenges around certain populations like English language learners. We went on to talk about just some suggestions for how that can be remedied. Representative Patterson actually brought up like ANCs that least have great weight. And so that might be something the state board can explore as far as adding to our recommendations. We do have to follow up with the Office of the Student Advocate to continue to discuss what families in the district are experiencing in terms of governance and issues they're encountering with the schools. Looking back through some of their reports over the years. We have finalized our work plan committee and request, so we talked through what you saw presented before us today. And last two things, we are starting a process to identify some metrics and goals on the front end for our engagement. So like it came up that we want to do a survey, we want to have these engagements, we want to get all this feedback, but we think it's really important for us to say, okay, like who are we trying to reach out to? What's enough people? And then backwards map and say, okay, what tactics do we need to use to get there? And that way, instead of saying like, all right, we need to do more engagement or we haven't done enough engagement, we've defined our success for ourselves on the front end, and then can better evaluate if we got there or not. So we're in the process of doing that. Hopefully, I have some homework as the chair in order to get us there for our next committee meeting. And our next committee meeting will actually feature a panel of experts who can speak to some other issues with board governance. That is our committee report. And it's posted on.
Thank you, Vice President
The longer
Thompson.
version.
We are now on to advocacy and outreach.
All right, so the long version is also on Simply. Thanks to Darren for taking really good notes. Also, the main takeaway is the Family Advisory Council work is moving forward. However, as chair, until I submit my grades to the University of Maryland on May 19th, I am out of pocket, but it's a bunch of to-do items related to, we want to create we want to give the opportunity for how you engage your constituents or people that are related to this family engagement piece. It's kind of like a dual role. So we'll have a one-pager that's kind of a quick and dirty, like this is like this. How do you experience going out to families and asking how they kind of experience the family engagement standards that ESSA has laid out in family-friendly ways? So basically, like what kind of engagement activities does your school have, those kind of things. The one page is the quick and easy one. So like, let's say, I know that's really weird. The one page is a really quick one. Like, let's say you might be at a community event or something like that, tabling really fast. Versus, let's say you attend an ANC meeting or an award education council meeting, something like that. We'll create a PowerPoint for that. And we're kind of just collecting and looking at things of what are schools doing very frequently related to family engagement, and what are things that schools might have a blind spot to or aren't engaging families as much. From your engagement out in the community during the summer, I know at least you will be out at least one thing. Hopefully you'll recruit some folks who might participate in our more in-depth engagement, family engagement council. So basically, we are giving you materials to collect information, but recruit and hopefully recruit different people. I know that's something else that O'Leary said. We want to make sure we have diversity in our families, not just bringing the same families to the table over and over again and I'm knocking stuff down. So we'll have like June, July to do that, and you can do it however you want to do it. But the goal is to bring back like 1 to 3 names that you would have us to reach out to, like this more formal group. So that's the biggest piece of what TC Outreach is doing. The rest is basically to do that I need to start, but hopefully you'll have some tangible items in June.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Reed. Next up, education standards. So in Representative Chang's absence, I will note a few items related to education standards committee work. First, I'm pleased that the committee has decided to apply for the NASB Early Literacy Committee Working Group. NASB is an excellent opportunity for us to learn from sister organizations and gain insight on early literacy as a pressing issue before the board. The committee is also keenly watching the ongoing work at Aussie related to the literacy plan and is hopeful that the funding to implement the plan will be made available. Doing that now. So we're translating it and hopefully money will be made available for Aussie to do the work they need to do. Finally, the committee and the full board, all of us, are eagerly awaiting the draft social studies standards. And after our excellent panel discussion at the April public meeting, folks from the committee and the staff were following up with additional questions that folks had for members of the panel. Any questions related to the committee's work, please send to Representative Chang via email for follow-up. I will say for everyone, which I think I shared with the committee, I am attending 2 meetings that I hope will provide more clarity on social studies. May 10th, Representative Thompson and I have our leadership meeting with the superintendent, and May 11th, I have been invited to a social studies specific meeting with folks at Aussie and hope that more clarity comes on one or both of those days. I've already tried to get some clarity, but hope that we'll get more then. Teacher practice and school support.
We discussed organizing a roundtable with teachers and assistant principals to discuss teacher retention. We decided that assistant principals are an overlooked source of information. Staff is going to write a summary memo on state-to-state comparisons on grow your own and apprenticeship programs, mentorship programs, and teacher attrition during the pandemic. And we're thinking about inviting leaders from Tennessee to discuss their teacher apprenticeship work to a future committee meeting. So basically that's what we talked about around that. So that's where we are. So hopefully we're going to, and we also are hoping that Mr. Hayworth is going to talk to Aussie about getting someone from Aussie to come talk to us about mentorships. He was charged with that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. O'Leary. External committees. I know Dr. Reed sent us an email update on the Research Practice Partnership. Anything else you want to give voice to? Nope. Okay. I had the NASB GAP meeting yesterday, Government Affairs Committee. There's a long list of links associated with federal updates, so I will just send that email to you all. Again, forgot the laptop, but we'll send it to you all when I get home tonight.
Yeah, we did have our NASB Policy and Education Positions Committee meeting. Not much, no big headlines there. We're at that point in the year where we start to break into groups to choose what we're talking about. So once all that gets finalized, I will let you know what it is that what 3 positions we have chosen to work on and where I did assign.
Any other external committee updates?
Yes.
Mr. Hayward.
I was the co-chair of the NASB DEI task force to identify opportunities for growth for NASB as an organization, both internally and externally on DEI issues. That work has now wrapped up. That was wrapped up in a presentation to the NASB board in March. The NASB board adopted those recommendations, and now I've been appointed to the JEDI committee, which is the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion group.
You're a Jedi? On May the 4th? It's Star Wars Day for any of the other nerds watching. May the 4th be with you.
So I am now the chair of this new committee that was formed through the work of the old committee. And so we are in the process of identifying individuals to serve on that committee through the entire nation. We're looking for representatives from each region, as well as from skateboard staff to start really working on this type of work. So not anything substantive update yet, but I did have a really great call with one of the board members from Massachusetts today who seemed eager to start this work, which is very exciting. So.
Hooray, and congratulations on being a Jedi. Any other external committees? Fantastic. Is there any items of new business from members? Yes, one member, new
Okay.
business.
So I don't think that this is the time to have a substantive discussion on this because some of us has been in for 5 hours, 6 hours. But a member of the student advisory, let me just put on my request all the way. A member of the student advisory committee came to me earlier this week, the very beginning of May, so like May 2nd, I think. And he's a student in one of the virtual schools, and he shared some concerns with me that I thought I would share with the whole board because I don't really know exactly what to do with them, like, and how to talk about these. So basically what he said, that he has some structural concerns with the program as a whole, but specifically right now, and this was like May 2nd, students are still being brought into the program and like into the classes. But there's a significant loss of like teachers who are just not, like he said, teachers are just disappearing or like leaving. And so that's where his concern comes in, is that like there are a lot of new students and there are not teachers to maintain that. He also mentioned other problems, but didn't specify what. I have asked him to come speak at the public meeting this month, and we're going to talk about it at the SAC meeting on Monday, but I just wanted to bring up these concerns now because I don't really know how to proceed.
Okay, thank you. I think if you get more information at the SAC meeting, that would be helpful to share with members.
Yes. And he's going to send me an email with the information that I can then forward to everybody.
Great. Thank you. Other new business, Dr. Reed.
Garfield Elementary School is named one of the Special Olympics banner schools, which is a big deal because one, they're the banner school the last 2 years for DC, and then 2, this year they're getting again probably the 7-year old, so top 5 banner schools for Special Olympics in the country. They're having a really big celebration and ESPN, Special Olympics national staff, and a whole bunch of other folks at Garfield on May 13th. It starts at 1:15. There's a panel, and then at 1:30, and then the ceremony is at 2:15. I guess the ceremony is probably the really sweet part, but all of it you're welcome to attend. So hopefully I will be traveling with family, but hopefully we can get somebody to represent from the board. It's a big deal. Thank you.
Can you send that to us?
Yes, I'll send it to everyone then. So yeah, and just the Special Olympics is a part of my portfolio for work. So they are really just like, I'm really excited. Yeah, they're like, we think you're connected to this school. And I was like, I am. So they're really excited and like rolling out the like red carpet for the students of Garfield Elementary. And I would love for you all to experience what they're going to do for the students and teachers. So I will support that.
Thank you. Vice President Thompson.
Quick flag, so you know it's coming. So one of the reasons that our budget total shrank for board governance is because we're going to ask y'all to do some work. And so I am delinquent and following up with Caitlin, but I'm going to do that before the week is out. For people who got to sit in our board governance session when we did the fall engagement, we are taking that on the road, which means when you go to ANC meetings, when you go to Ed Council meetings, when you go to other meetings, there will be a bite-sized, pocket-sized travel version. And we want you to collect information from your constituents. That costs $0, but of course it's priceless. And so I'm just flagging that this expectation is coming. But so new business, excited, yay, work to do.
Thank you so much, Vice President Thompson. Dr. O'Leary.
I just want to give a shout out to Aussie for the fabulous event last night for teacher recognition for the last 3 years, the outstanding teachers. And it was really beautiful event, very heartwarming and encouraging. A lot of educators were recognized who are doing a fabulous job. And we also know, since this is Teacher Appreciation Week, that there are thousands of teachers in the city that are doing a fabulous job all the time. And to add to that, we're still doing our Mrs. O'Leary's Books for Friends. And we can still, if y'all have your books, student advisory committee that you still have in the house that you're not using anymore, please get in touch with me. And we got a donation from the RIF program for almost 8,000 those McDonald's little Happy Meal books
Oh, I love it.
that we're putting out to schools in Spanish. They're in Spanish. And so I've talked to Emily, and she's distributing some in Ward 1, and I'm distributing them also in Ward 4.
Excellent.
If you want to be part of that, just let me know of a school that could use books, and if we can get some other books that we can get in touch with.
All right, congratulations, Dr. Dover. Excellent. Any other new business? All right, seeing no further business before the state board, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Is there a second? Thank you, Representative Wattenberg. This meeting of the state board is adjourned at 8:47 p.m. on May 4th, 2022. Good night, friends.
Thank you.
And I think